The sky tore open above Helios 19, a wound in reality that bled impossible colors across the toxic atmosphere. Through that screaming gap between worlds, a single figure tumbled, trailing wisps of dimensional displacement like a comet's tail. The rift pulsed once, twice, then collapsed in on itself with a sound like reality sobbing, leaving only the perpetual gray-black clouds that had choked this world for millennia. Ben Tennyson had no time to process what was happening. One moment he'd been fighting a multi-dimensional entity that had pushed the Omnitrix beyond its limits, the next he was falling through a kaleidoscope of fractured space-time. The device on his wrist sparked and flared its normally steady green glow, flickering between colors that shouldn't exist. Warning symbols he'd never seen before scrolled across its face, alien script that spoke of catastrophic dimensional breach and emergency protocol activation. He crashed through layers of polluted cloud, each one thick with ash and chemical residue that stung even through his jacket. The air tasted of rust and burning promethium of industrial decay, concentrated over 10,000 years of relentless production. As he broke through the lowest cloud layer, the world below resolved into something out of a nightmare. Helios 9 stretched beneath him in all its horrific grandeur. Hive spires taller than mountains clawed at the sky, their surfaces encrusted with gothic architecture and millennia of accumulated grime. Between the spires, hab blocks, stacked upon hab blocks, formed canyons of human misery, each level home to millions who would never see natural sunlight. Smoke belched from 1,000 manufactorums, the great engines of imperial production that ground human lives into weapons and munitions with mechanical indifference. The entire planet seemed to be one vast machine, its gears turned by the flesh and blood of those condemned to serve. The Omnitrix finally stabilized its fail-safes, preventing Ben from becoming a smear on the rockcrete below. Green light flared around him as the transformation took hold. His body shifted, compacted, accelerated. XLR8's streamlined form cut through the poisoned air like a knife, the Kinesilaran's natural speed allowing him to control his descent. He hit the ground, running momentum carrying him across a transit plaza where hundreds of workers trudged between shifts, their faces hidden behind rebreathers, their eyes dead with exhaustion. Ben skidded to a stop in the shadow of a statue depicting a golden armored figure seated on an ornate throne surrounded by angels and lightning. The craftsmanship was incredible, but there was something oppressive about it, something that spoke of absolute authority and the crushing weight of enforced faith. He shifted back to human form, the Omnitrix cycling down with a soft chime that sounded obscenely cheerful in this grim place. "Okay," he muttered, scanning his surroundings. "This is definitely not the null void." The workers gave him a wide berth, their movements suggesting people who had learned that curiosity was dangerous. A few glanced at him with something between fear and confusion. His green jacket and relatively clean appearance marking him as impossibly out of place in a world where everything was the color of rust and despair. The Omnitrix translated their muttered comments, automatically feeding him fragments of low Gothic that spoke of quotas missed and punishment details of rations cut and enforcers on patrol. Ben's stomach tightened. He'd been to a lot of strange places, faced a lot of weird situations, but there was something fundamentally wrong about this world. It wasn't just the pollution or the overcrowding. It was the atmosphere of grinding, institutionalized suffering. The acceptance of cruelty as the natural order of things. A scream cut through the plaza's ambient noise, the clash of machinery and tramping feet. Ben's head snapped toward the sound, hero instinct overriding confusion. Through the press of bodies, he saw them. A group of robed figures, their garments marked with symbols that hurt to look at directly, symbols that seemed to writhe and shift when observed. They had surrounded a cluster of civilians near the plaza's edge, where the transit ways opened into darker, less traveled passages. The cultists moved with terrible purpose. One held a woman by her hair, forcing her to her knees, while another raised a curved blade that gleamed with an unnatural sheen. A child no more than 7 or 8 huddled against the wall, eyes wide with the particular terror of someone who understood they were about to witness something unspeakable. The crowd melted away. Not running that would have drawn attention, but flowing around the scene like water around stone. This was survival instinct honed over generations. To interfere was to die. To watch was to live. The Imperium had taught its citizens well. Ben didn't have those lessons. He'd never learned to turn away. The Omnitrix came to life at his touch, its interface responding to intent as much as command. Green light washed over the plaza, and where a 16-year-old human had stood, XLR8 now crouched. The Kinecellerin's eyes tracked the scene with predatory focus, calculating angles and distances in microseconds. Time seemed to slow, as adrenaline and alien biology combined to accelerate his perception beyond human limits. He moved. The cultists registered only a blue blur before their captive was gone, plucked from their grasp and deposited 50 meters away among the fleeing workers. XLR8 spun tail whipping around to catch 2 of the robed figures across their legs, sending them tumbling. The child still huddled against the wall, frozen in terror. "It's okay," Ben said, his voice translated automatically by the Omnitrix. "I've got you." He scooped the child up with surprising gentleness for someone moving at hundreds of kilometers per hour, then deposited him safely behind the statue. The entire rescue took perhaps 2 seconds. The cultists recovered with disturbing speed. Their initial shock gave way to something worse, religious fervor. The largest among them, his face scarred with ritual brands, raised his hand. Ben caught a glimpse of something in his palm, a symbol that seemed to pull at his vision, trying to draw his attention down into infinite depths. The air around the cultist's hand began to shimmer with wrongness. XLR8's instincts screamed danger. He dodged as a bolt of violet energy lanced through the space where he'd been standing, leaving a streak of corrosion on the rockcrete. The stone didn't just melt, it seemed to age centuries, in seconds crumbling to dust. "Okay, definitely not normal bad guys," Ben muttered. He slapped the Omnitrix again. This time the transformation carried an edge of crystalline beauty. Diamond Head emerged from the green flash, his body composed of nearly indestructible Petrosapian crystal. Another bolt of corrupt energy splashed against his chest and dissipated harmlessly, unable to find purchase against a biology that existed partially outside normal space-time. The cultists' coordination was impressive. They spread out without verbal communication, forming a half-circle that tried to pen Diamond Head against the statue. More of that strange energy gathered in their hands, building to critical mass. Behind them, Ben could see workers being dragged from the shadows, more victims for whatever nightmare ritual these people practiced. He'd seen enough. Diamond Head's arm morphed crystal spikes erupting from his shoulders and back. He slammed both fists into the rockcrete. The impact sent a shockwave through the ground, knocking the cultists off their feet. Before they could recover, he was among them. Crystal constructs erupted from the plaza floor, forming cages around each cultist with the precision of someone who'd been doing this for years. One managed to complete his incantation. The violet energy coalesced into something with too many angles, something that hurt to perceive. It lunged at Diamond Head with impossible speed, barbed tentacles reaching for his face. Ben shifted his arm into a shield on pure reflex. The thing struck crystal and shattered, dissolving into wisps of acrid smoke. The transformation timer chimed. Ben shifted back to human form, slightly out of breath. The cultists remained trapped in their crystal cages, spitting curses in a language that made the Omnitrix hesitate before translating. When it finally did, the word spoke of blood gods and eternal service, of flesh offerings and rewards beyond mortal comprehension. Ben turned away from them, focusing on the rescued civilians. The woman he'd saved first stood with her back against the wall, eyes wide. The child peeked out from behind the statue, expression caught between terror and wonder. "Are you okay?" Ben asked, keeping his voice gentle despite his racing heart. The woman's mouth worked soundlessly for a moment. Then she dropped to her knees, hands forming a strange gesture, two fists pressed together in front of her chest. Around the plaza, those few workers who had remained began to do the same. A murmur rose from them, words repeated with the cadence of prayer. "The Emperor's light?" someone whispered. "He sent one of his angels." "The green light," another voice called. "The prophecy spoke true." Ben raised his hands, trying to forestall the growing religious fervor. No, I'm not. I'm just trying to help." "You don't need to." His words were drowned out by the growing chorus. More workers had stopped, drawn by the commotion. The story was already spreading, taking on mythic proportions. A being of green fire who had struck down the servants of the dark gods. A warrior who moved faster than sight and turned his flesh to unbreakable crystal. A savior who had appeared in their darkest hour. Ben felt overwhelmingly out of his depth. He'd dealt with fans before, but this was different. These people weren't excited, they were desperate. They had seized upon his intervention like drowning men grasping for driftwood. And he could see in their eyes that they would not easily let go of this hope. The sound of heavy boots on rockcrete cut through the murmurs. Ben turned to see a squad of soldiers approaching their uniforms, a dull gray-green, their weapons raised and ready. They moved with professional discipline, forming a perimeter around the plaza with practiced efficiency. Their armor was crude compared to what Ben was used to, but the weapons they carried radiated obvious lethality. At their head walked a man whose uniform marked him as different from the others. More ornate, more decorated, festooned with medals and symbols of rank. A wide-brimmed hat sat on his head, and beneath it his eyes were cold as winter. He surveyed the scene with the expression of someone who had seen too much and believed too little. "Disperse," he commanded, and his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Return to your HAB units immediately. Curfew protocols are now in effect." The workers scattered like leaves before a storm, even the woman Ben had saved, disappearing into the crowd. Within moments, the plaza was empty, save for Ben, the trapped cultists, and the soldiers. The officer approached slowly, one hand resting on the ornate pistol at his hip. "Identify yourself," he said, and there was no room for negotiation in his tone. Ben raised his hands in a placating gesture. "Look, I know this looks weird, but I'm not a threat. Those people were attacking civilians, and I just—" "Identify yourself," the officer repeated, and this time his hand moved to his pistol grip. "Ben Tennyson," he said quickly. I'm not from around here. There was this entity, and the Omnitrix overloaded, and I got pulled through some kind of dimensional rift." The officer's eyes had locked onto the Omnitrix. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted. His free hand made a gesture, and the soldiers' weapons tracked toward Ben with mechanical precision. "Xeno's artifact," the officer said, and the words carried the weight of absolute condemnation. "Possible shape-shifting capability. Extreme threat level." "Wait, what? You are under suspicion of tech heresy, Xeno's corruption, and unlicensed operation of prohibited technology within Imperial space. Under the authority of His Most Divine Majesty, the God Emperor of mankind, You will submit to immediate arrest and interrogation. Ben's hand moved toward the Omnitrix on pure instinct. The soldiers opened fire. Last beams, coherent light weapons filled the air where he'd been standing a split second before. He rolled behind the statue, heart pounding, as more shots carved chunks from the stonework. This was insane. These were humans he thought they were human, and they were trying to kill him for helping people. The cognitive dissonance made his head spin. Where was he? What kind of place executed people for stopping a murder? A soldier rounded the statue, weapon tracking. Ben slapped the Omnitrix without looking. The transformation took hold, just as the soldier's finger tightened on the trigger. 4 arms erupted from the green flash towering over the human. The Tetraman's massive hand closed around the last gun's barrel and crushed it to scrap metal. He tossed the ruined weapon aside, then so gently pushed the soldier away. I don't want to fight you. 4 arms rumbled his deep voice, carrying across the plaza. I'm not your enemy. The officer had his pistol out now, a massive thing that looked more like a small cannon. Fire at will, he commanded. Ben's chest tightened with more than just the impact of last beams against his Tetraman hide. These people wouldn't stop. They couldn't stop. Whatever had broken in them, whatever turned them into killing machines who could watch children die without intervening, it wasn't going to be fixed with a speech or a demonstration. He leapt straight up, 4 arms' massive legs propelling him meters into the air. He caught the edge of a hab-block balcony and pulled himself up, then up again, climbing the side of the building with practiced ease. Last beams tracked him, scorching stone and metal. But he was already too high, too fast. From his perch 3 stories up, Ben looked down at the plaza. The soldiers were already securing the cultists, moving them with efficient brutality. The officer was speaking into a bulky communication device, his words inaudible, but his intent clear. The timer chimed. 4 arms faded back to Ben, leaving him crouched on a narrow ledge, breathing hard. Below, the soldiers were setting up equipment, scanning devices of some kind, their surfaces covered in brass and strange symbols. Ben turned and ran, leaping from balcony to balcony, putting distance between himself and the plaza. His mind raced. He needed to figure out where he was, needed to find a way home, needed to understand what kind of nightmare world executed people for heroism. Behind him, in the shadows of the plaza, the officer lowered his communication device. His report had been received. His orders were clear. An inquisitor was already en route. The hunt for the green anomaly had begun. The officer's name was Sergeant Varn, and he had served the God Emperor for 23 years, without questioning a single order. He did not question now as he watched the green-lit figure disappear into the urban labyrinth of Helios 9. His voxcaster crackled with static, then resolved into a voice that made even his veteran nerves tighten. Maintain perimeter. The target must not leave the sector. Understood, my lord, Varn replied, snapping to attention, despite the fact that his interlocutor was kilometers away aboard an orbital station. The creature displayed multiple morphological configurations, estimated threat level. I have reviewed your picked captures, Sergeant. The entity's capabilities are noted. A pause filled with the subtle hum of cogitator arrays processing forbidden data. Inquisitor Malreth will handle this personally. You are relieved of field command. Hold position and await further instruction. The Vox cut out. Varn exhaled slowly, grateful despite himself. Whatever that green-skinned abomination was, it had moved beyond his authority the moment it demonstrated Xeno's capabilities. Better to leave such matters to those whose souls were armored against corruption. Above Helios 9, in the observation deck of the orbital fortress, designated Sanctum Vigil Inquisitor, Ezekiel Malreth studied the hololith projection with eyes that had witnessed horrors beyond mortal comprehension. He was a tall man, gaunt to the point of emaciation. His face a network of scars and augmetic enhancements that spoke of centuries spent purging the alien and the heretical. His power armor, ancient and revered, bore the symbols of the Ordo Xenos crossed bones beneath a stylized eye that saw all impurities. "Analysis," he commanded, and the servo skull hovering beside him chittered through its vox grill. "Xenoform designation unknown, my lord. Physical mutations inconsistent with documented species. The artifact on its left appendage displays energy signatures that defy classification. Preliminary assessment suggests technology of non-imperial origin operating on principles incompatible with standard mechanicus doctrine." Malreth's thin lips compressed into a bloodless line. In his 300 years of service, he had catalogued 17,000 distinct Xenos species. He had personally overseen the extinction of 43. This creature fit none of his parameters, which made it either magnificently rare or catastrophically dangerous. Possibly both. "Prepare Kill Team Obsidian," he said. "Full containment protocols. I want it taken alive, if possible. The artifact is priority 1. And if capture proves impossible, my lord, then we learn what it takes to kill it." The Inquisitor turned from the hololith, his augmetic eye whirring as it adjusted to the change in focal depth. Behind him stood 12 warriors in midnight black carapace armor, each one a veteran of 100 battles against the alien threat. They carried Helgun's laser weapons of devastating power and moved with the coordinated precision of men who trusted each other with their lives because they had no other choice. "The Emperor protects," Malreth intoned. "The Emperor protects." His kill team echoed, and the words carried the weight of absolute faith. Ben had found shelter in what might generously be called an alley, though it more closely resembled a canyon carved between 2 hab blocks by centuries of industrial runoff. The walls wept rust-colored liquid that pooled in channels worn smooth by time, and the air tasted of chemicals he couldn't name. Somewhere above, voices echoed in languages the Omnitrix struggled to parse corrupted Gothic mixed with machine cant and what might have been prayer. He slumped against the wall, trying to catch his breath and make sense of what had just happened. The Omnitrix's interface glowed softly in the darkness, displaying readouts he'd never seen before. Dimensional coordinates that didn't match any known universe. Energy signatures that suggested he'd traveled not just through space, but through the fundamental structure of reality itself. "Okay," he muttered, pulling up the device's diagnostic screen. "Okay, this is bad, but I've dealt with bad before. Just need to figure out where I am, find a way to recalibrate the dimensional matrix, and..." The Omnitrix's proximity alert flared red. Ben's head snapped up just as figures emerged from both ends of the alley. They moved with inhuman synchronization, weapons raised, and in the split second before they opened fire, Ben registered the professional competence in their stance. These weren't panicked soldiers. These were hunters. He slapped the Omnitrix. The transformation took him in a burst of green light. And suddenly the world was a symphony of electromagnetic frequencies. Chromastone's crystalline form caught the first volley of las fire and drank it in his body, converting the coherent light into raw energy that pulsed through his silicon lattice structure. It felt like drinking lightning, painful and exhilarating in equal measure. "I don't want to fight you," Ben called out, his voice taking on the harmonic resonance of a crystal sapien. "I was trying to help those people. Can't we just talk about this?" The only response was another volley. The soldiers had spread out, taking covering positions behind rusted pipes and broken machinery. They fired in precise bursts, conserving ammunition while maintaining constant pressure. Professional. disciplined, utterly unwilling to negotiate. Ben raised his hands, not in surrender, but in demonstration. The energy he'd absorbed pulsed through his palms, arcing between his fingers in displays of violet light. "I can defend myself," he warned, "but I don't want to hurt anyone. Please just stop shooting." A figure stepped from the shadows behind the kill team, and Ben's crystalline body registered the wrongness immediately. The man, if he was a man, radiated authority like heat from a furnace. His armor was masterwork quality, ancient and lovingly maintained, and the symbols etched into its surface seemed to writhe when observed directly. But worse than any of that was his eye. The biological one was bad enough, pale and cold, and utterly empty of mercy. The augmetic eye that had replaced its twin was worse, a lens of dark crystal that seemed to focus not on Ben's body, but on something deeper. Specimen exhibits defensive capabilities exceeding baseline predictions. Inquisitor Malreth observed his voice carrying the dry rasp of someone who had breathed too much incense smoke over too many funeral pyres. "Recommend escalation to secondary protocols." "Secondary protocols?" Ben repeated the Omnitrix, translating the high Gothic automatically. "What is that?" The kill team withdrew with mechanical precision, falling back to positions that gave them clear lines of retreat. Ben's danger sense screamed a warning in frequencies only Chromastone could perceive. Something was coming. Something that made the soldiers, hardened warriors who had fired on him without hesitation, retreat as if from a plague zone. Malreth raised one gauntleted hand. In it he held a device that looked like a jewelry box crafted from human bone and dark iron. Symbols crawled across its surface, and just looking at them made Ben's crystalline structure ache in ways that had nothing to do with physical stress. The Inquisitor's lips moved in what might have been prayer or might have been command words, in a language that the Omnitrix refused to translate, as if recognizing that some things should not be given voice. The box opened. The thing that emerged made Ben's every instinct scream to run. It had been human once he could still see the basic structure beneath the corruption. But something had hollowed it out and filled the empty spaces with nightmare. Its skin was the color of old parchment stretched too tight over bones that bent at wrong angles. Its eyes burned with foxfire, and when its mouth opened, the sound that emerged was a choir of screaming voices, all trying to speak at once. "Demon host," Malreth said, and his tone carried grim satisfaction. "Class Theta 7, bound by the rite of subjugation and held by 17 seals of purity. Your artifact is interesting, creature. Let us see how it fares against the denizens of the Imperium." Ben didn't understand half the words, but he understood the threat. The demon host lunged with speed that defied its broken puppet appearance, crossing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Chromastone barely managed to raise his arms before impact. The collision sent him crashing through a rusted pipe, polluted water spraying across his crystalline hide. The demon host followed, and where its hands touched Ben's crystalline structure cracked. Not from physical force, but from something else, something that tried to unmake him at a fundamental level. The voices that poured from its mouth spoke of entropy and dissolution, of the heat death of stars and the silence at the end of all things. Ben lashed out with a burst of stored energy, the violet beam catching the demon host's center mass and hurling it backward. It tumbled through the air and landed in a crouch that should have shattered human bones. Instead, it straightened with sounds like wet leather tearing its body, reknitting damage that should have been lethal. "What are you?" Ben gasped, switching to a defensive posture as the thing circled him. The demon host's response was to lunge at the civilians. In his focus on the immediate threat, Ben had forgotten about the workers who lived in the hab units adjoining the alley. They huddled in doorways now too terrified to run, and the demon host moved toward them with terrible purpose. It didn't need to kill Ben. It just needed to make him watch what would happen to the innocent if he continued to resist. No. Ben's shout carried harmonics of pure rage. He interposed himself between the demon host and its targets, taking a strike meant to tear through human flesh. His crystalline structure absorbed the blow. But he felt something in the impact, a psychic echo that bypassed physical defenses and clawed at his mind with metaphysical talons. The Omnitrix pulsed. Data streamed across Ben's consciousness analysis of the demon host's energy signature, identifying it as something that existed partially outside normal space. It wasn't truly alive, not in any biological sense. It was a wound in reality, a place where the membrane between dimensions had grown so thin that something from the other side had leaked through. And if it was made of dimensional energy, Ben slapped the Omnitrix symbol on his chest. The transformation rippled through him, Chromastone's crystalline form, melting into something sleeker, more streamlined. Feedback emerged from the green flash, his body covered in what looked like circuitry-made flesh. Energy coils on his head and back pulsed with hungry anticipation. The demon host struck again, but this time Ben was ready. His hand shot out and clamped onto the creature's wrist. Where Chromastone had absorbed energy, feedback devoured it. The dimensional breach that sustained the demon host began to unravel as Ben pulled on it, drawing the otherworldly power into himself like water down a drain. The demon host's screaming intensified, all 17 voices rising in discordant agony. It tried to pull away, but Ben held on with desperate strength. The energy tasted wrong, corrupted, and poisonous in ways that made his conductoid biology recoil. But he forced himself to keep drinking. If he stopped, if he let go for even a second, the thing would kill everyone in the alley. The seals that bound the demon host began to crack. Ben could see them now through feedback's energy-sensing vision. 17 points of light that held the creature anchored to reality. As he drained its power, those anchors weakened. One by one, they shattered. "Impossible," Malreth whispered, his voice carrying across the alley despite the demon host's screaming. "The bindings are absolute. Nothing should be able to..." The 17th seal broke. The demon host collapsed, its body dissolving into ash that scattered on the toxic wind. The dimensional breach sealed itself with an audible pop, reality reasserting its dominance over the space where wrongness had existed. Ben staggered, releasing energy he couldn't safely contain as violet arcs that earthed themselves in the rusted metal around him. He looked up at Malreth, and even through feedback's alien features, his expression carried human determination. "I told you," he said, voice heavy with exhaustion. "I don't want to fight. I'm not your enemy." The Inquisitor's face was unreadable behind its network of scars and augmetics. But when he spoke, his words carried the weight of absolute certainty. "You have demonstrated the ability to interact with warp phenomena. Your artifact draws upon dimensional principles that parallel the Imperium. Whether you intend harm or not is irrelevant." He turned to his kill team, who had watched the entire exchange with weapons ready. "The creature is to be captured alive. The Ordo Xenos requires its artifact for study. If capture proves impossible, execute it with extreme prejudice and recover the device from the corpse." "Wait," Ben said, backing away as the soldiers advanced. "You can't be serious. I just saved those people. That thing was going to kill them. You employed Xenos technology in defiance of Imperial law. You demonstrated capabilities consistent with warp corruption. And most damningly, you have revealed knowledge of forces that no untainted mind should comprehend." Malreth's augmetic eye whirred as it focused on the Omnitrix. The device will be catalogued, dissected, and if possible repurposed for humanity's benefit. As for you. He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear enough. Ben's value to the Imperium began and ended with what they could learn from his technology. The Omnitrix timer chimed. Feedback faded back to human form, leaving Ben standing in his jacket and jeans, one hand resting on the device that had become both his greatest asset and most dangerous liability. The kill team had him surrounded, now Hellguns trained on his center mass, no escape routes, no room to maneuver. Last chance, Malreth said. Submit to Imperial authority. The process will be painful, but the Emperor's mercy is that it will be brief. Ben's hand moved to the Omnitrix dial. The soldier's tensed fingers tightening on triggers. For a moment, the alley held its breath, waiting to see if the green-lit stranger would surrender or fight. Then Ben smiled, and it was the expression of someone who had been underestimated many times before. You know what I've learned, he said. Guys who talk about mercy usually don't have any. He slammed his hand down on the Omnitrix. The transformation took him as the first last bolts lanced through the space where he'd been standing. Goop erupted from the green flash, his body losing cohesion and flowing around the incoming fire like water. The kill team's shots passed through him harmlessly, striking walls and floors, and accomplishing nothing except to demonstrate the futility of conventional weapons. Ben oozed up the wall and over the edge, leaving the soldiers scrambling to adjust their firing solutions. Malreth's voice cut through the confusion, cold and commanding. All units converge on Sector 7 Gamma. The Xenos is attempting to flee. Standard containment has failed. Implementing Protocol Extremis. As Goop flowed across rooftops and down walls, moving through the urban landscape with the freedom of something that didn't have to obey physical constraints, Ben heard the sirens begin to wail. Not the simple alert klaxons from before, but something deeper and more ominous. Throughout the hive sector, blast doors began to seal. Gun servitors swiveled to active status. And somewhere in the command centers that coordinated Imperial authority, someone was making a calculation about acceptable losses. The hunt had escalated. The prey had demonstrated abilities that threatened the hunters. And in the grim darkness of the far future, there was only one response to a threat that conventional force could not eliminate. Inquisitor Malreth would have his prize, or he would burn the sector to ash, ensuring that no one else could claim it. In the calculus of the Imperium, both outcomes were acceptable. The individual was nothing. The preservation of humanity's dominance over the Xenos was everything. Ben didn't know it yet, but he had just been declared extremis, a threat requiring total eradication, regardless of collateral cost. The full weight of Imperial authority would now be brought to bear on the green-lit stranger who had thought he could save people in a galaxy that had long ago forgotten what salvation meant. The descent into the lower hive was like falling through layers of history, each level marking another century of accumulated misery. Ben dropped through maintenance shafts and ventilation tunnels, moving deeper into Helios 9's bowels, where the Emperor's light, both literal and metaphorical, had dimmed to barely a flicker. The air grew thicker with each meter of descent, heavy with industrial pollutants and the accumulated exhalations of billions of souls, packed into spaces never meant to sustain human life. Goop's amorphous form made the journey almost easy, his body squeezing through gaps that would have trapped anything with a fixed shape. But the Omnitrix timer was running low, the device's power reserves depleted by the fight with the demon host. Ben could feel the transformation beginning to destabilize his consciousness, struggling to maintain coherence as his body threatened to simply disperse into component molecules. The timer chimed its final warning. Green light flashed in the darkness of a corroded pipe, and suddenly Ben was tumbling solid again, and entirely too aware of gravity's demands. He hit the floor of what might have been a transit corridor once rolling to absorb the impact. Pain flared in his shoulder, nothing broken, but he'd have bruises. Around him, the lower hive stretched away into darkness, broken only by flickering lumens and the occasional chemical glow of something that probably shouldn't be exposed to open air. Ben lay still for a moment, catching his breath and trying to process what had just happened. He'd fought aliens, demons, interdimensional tyrants, and cosmic entities. But those enemies had wanted something power, revenge, conquest. The cold calculation in Malreth's voice had been different. Ben hadn't been an enemy to be defeated. He'd been a specimen to be catalogued, a resource to be extracted, a problem to be solved through dissection. The sound of movement snapped him back to the present. Ben rolled to his feet, hands coming up in a defensive stance before his eyes adjusted to the gloom, and he realized what he was looking at. People. Dozens of them emerging from doorways and alcoves like rats from their warrens. But these weren't the dead-eyed workers he'd seen in the plaza above. These people wore rags and improvised armor, their faces painted with symbols that the Omnitrix struggled to categorize. Some carried crude weapons, lengths of pipe, sharpened metal, improvised firearms that looked more dangerous to their users than their targets. "Another one," someone muttered in low Gothic, the words translated automatically. "Fallen from the upper levels. Check for marks." An old woman pushed through the crowd, her back bent under the weight of years, but her eyes sharp as broken glass. She studied Ben with the expression of someone who had learned to judge threats through decades of survival in places where the Arbites never patrolled. Her gaze lingered on the Omnitrix, and something flickered across her face. Not recognition exactly, but awareness that she was seeing something that shouldn't exist. "No gang marks," she announced. "No workers' stamps. Clothes too clean." She stepped closer, and Ben forced himself not to back away. "You're not from the lower hive, boy. Question is whether you're Arbite's bait or just lost." "Lost," Ben said quickly. "Definitely lost. I don't work for anyone here. I was trying to help some people and these soldiers started shooting at me and I had to run and the green light." The voice came from the back of the crowd, young and awed. A girl pushed forward, maybe 7 or 8 years old, her face smudged with soot, but her eyes wide with something that might have been hope. "You're the green light, the one who fought the Dark Ones in Sector 7 Gamma." The crowd's murmurs shifted, hostility giving way to confusion and curiosity. Ben saw weapons being lowered, postures relaxing fractionally. The old woman's eyes narrowed. "That true? You the one they're turning the sector inside out looking for?" Ben hesitated, then nodded. "I stopped some people who were attacking civilians. The soldiers called me Xenos, said I was using forbidden technology. They tried to capture me, and when I fought back, He trailed off, not sure how to explain protocol extremis when he barely understood it himself. The old woman spat onto the corroded floor, the gesture carrying more eloquent disgust than words. "Arbites. Throne-cursed bastards wouldn't spit on you if you were burning. But they'll tear apart 100 hab blocks looking for one runner." She studied Ben again, then seemed to come to a decision. "My name's Henna. You want to survive down here, you follow my rules. First rule, nobody moves alone. Second rule, you don't question where we take you. Third rule, if the servitors come, you run and don't look back. Servitors, you'll know them when you see them." Henna turned to the crowd. "Spread the word. Arbites are running a full sweep. Anyone with warrants or contraband, get it buried now. And someone fetch Kyle. If anyone can hide this one properly, it's him." The crowd dispersed with surprising efficiency, melting back into the shadows like they'd never been there. Only the little girl remained staring at Ben with unblinking intensity. He managed to smile, trying to project a confidence he didn't feel. "What's your name?" he asked. "Mara." She glanced at the Omnitrix, then back to his face. "Is it true you can change your shape? Become a warrior of light?" "Something like that. The device lets me transform into different aliens, different species. Each one has special abilities." Mara processed this with the seriousness of a child who had grown up in a place where fairy tales were dangerous luxuries. "The priests say shapeshifters are servants of the dark gods, but you fought the dark ones. You saved people." She reached out as if to touch the Omnitrix, then pulled back. "Are you a saint?" The question hit Ben harder than he'd expected. In his world, people knew heroes were just people with powers and a willingness to use them. But here in this nightmare of industrial decay and enforced ignorance, the concept of someone helping without demanding worship or payment seemed to require divine explanation. "I'm not a saint," he said gently. "I'm just someone who doesn't like bullies." Mara smiled, the expression transforming her soot-stained face. "Then you're in the right place. The lower hive is nothing but bullies all the way down to the sump pools." Footsteps echoed down the corridor, quick, purposeful, but not the heavy tread of soldiers. A man emerged from the gloom, young but weathered, with the kind of lean build that came from too much work and not enough food. His eyes swept the corridor with practiced efficiency before settling on Ben. "You're the anomaly." It wasn't a question. "Henna says you need to disappear for a while. I can arrange that, but we need to move. The Arbites have deployed Auspex sweeps. They're looking for your energy signature." "My what?" "The device on your wrist. It puts out emissions that show up on their scanners. We need to get you somewhere shielded before they triangulate your position." Ben fell in beside Kyle as the man set off down the corridor at a quick pace. Mara followed like a shadow, apparently having decided that her presence was non-negotiable. They moved through passages that barely deserved the name gaps between Hablok's maintenance tunnels that had been expanded by generations of desperate inhabitants, vertical shafts where corroded ladders descended into darkness that seemed to have no bottom. The lower hive revealed itself in fragments, children playing in pools of something that definitely wasn't water, their laughter carrying a brittle edge that spoke of joy carved from desperation. Prayer shrines tucked into alcoves, their icons so worn by devotion that the emperor's face had been reduced to an abstract suggestion of features. Markets where contraband was traded openly, Xeno's artifacts, forbidden texts, substances that promised escape from the grinding misery of existence, even if that escape was temporary and chemically induced. And everywhere the people. Billions of them stacked in hab units like cargo in a warehouse, living and dying without ever seeing the sky. Some wore the brands of criminal gangs, while others bore the scars of industrial accidents that had left them too damaged for productive labor. They watched Ben pass with expressions that ranged from curiosity to suspicion to something that might have been hope. "They already know," Kyle said, noting Ben's discomfort. "Word travels fast down here. By now, half the lower hive knows the green light is running from the Arbites. You're either going to become a legend or get a lot of people killed. Possibly both." "I didn't ask for this," Ben muttered. "Nobody asks for anything in the lower hive. We just take what we can and survive as long as possible." Kyle stopped at what looked like a solid wall, then pressed a sequence of corroded panels. A section swung inward, revealing a passage barely wide enough for a human to squeeze through. "This leads to the old water reclamation sector. Been abandoned for 300 years. The pumps failed and the Mechanicus decided it was cheaper to build new ones than repair the old system." They slipped through the gap, and Kyle sealed it behind them. The air quality somehow managed to get worse, thick with the smell of stagnant water and rust. Ben's eyes watered, and he had to fight the urge to cough. Mara seemed unbothered, her small form navigating the darkness with the confidence of someone who had never known anything better. "Down here, you're invisible to their scanners," Kale explained. "Too much interference from the old machinery. But it also means we're on our own if something goes wrong." What could go wrong? Kale's laugh was bitter. Everything. The Arbeites could decide it's easier to just collapse this whole sector. The gangs could decide you're worth more as a bounty than as a symbol. Or the things that live in the deep dark could decide they're hungry. He saw Ben's expression and shrugged. "Welcome to the lower hive. The Emperor protects, but down here, he protects a lot more selectively than the priests like to admit." They moved deeper into the abandoned sector, descending staircases that groaned under their weight and crossing catwalks that swayed alarmingly over darkness that seemed absolute. Ben's hand stayed near the Omnitrix, ready to transform at the first sign of threat. But nothing emerged from the shadows, except the occasional scatter of movement that might have been rats, if rats could grow to the size of dogs and survive on toxic waste. Finally, Kyle stopped in what might have been a control room once. Ancient cogitators lined the walls, their screens dark and their blessed machinery silent. But there were signs of habitation: bedrolls, a small chemical stove, containers of water that looked relatively clean. "This is one of our safe houses," Kale explained. "The Resistance uses it when things get too hot above." "Resistance?" Ben latched onto the word. "There's organized opposition to all this." "Opposition is a strong word. Mostly we just try to survive and help others do the same. Smuggle medicine to the sick blocks, hide people who've been marked for punishment details, spread information that the authorities would rather keep buried." Kale sat down on one of the bedrolls, exhaustion evident in every line of his body. "It's not glamorous work, and we don't win often. But sometimes just surviving is its own kind of victory." Mara had already claimed a corner, curling up with the ease of someone who could sleep anywhere. Ben sat across from Kale, acutely aware that he'd brought danger to these people. The Inquisitor Malreth wouldn't stop searching. And when the Imperium wanted something, it had resources that dwarfed anything Ben had faced before. "Why help me?" he asked. "You don't know me. You don't know if I'm telling the truth about trying to help people. For all you know, I could be exactly what they say, some kind of Xenos infiltrator." Kyle was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of too many years living in a place where hope was a luxury and kindness was often fatal. 3 years ago, my sister got sick. Nothing exotic, just an infection from a cut that got contaminated in the chem pools. The medici refused to treat her because we couldn't pay their tithes. The priests said her suffering was the Emperor's will, that she should embrace her pain as penance for unspecified sins. He looked at Ben, and his eyes were old beyond his years. She died over 6 days. By the end, she was begging for death, and I couldn't even give her that mercy. Kyle stood and walked to the grimy window, staring out at the darkness of the lower hive. "I don't know if you're a saint or a Xenos or something else entirely, but I watched you fight that demon host. You could have run, you were fast enough. Instead, you stayed to protect people you'd never met. That kind of stupid courage." He laughed, the sound empty of humor. Maybe that's what passes for divine intervention in this nightmare. Someone who still thinks people are worth saving. Before Ben could respond, a sound echoed through the abandoned sector. Not the groan of stressed metal or the drip of contaminated water, but something regular and mechanical. Footsteps. dozens of them moving with inhuman synchronization. Kael's face went white. Servitors. They found us already. What are servitors? Ben asked, standing and moving toward the door. Lobotomized criminals repurposed as biological robots. No mercy, no hesitation, no way to negotiate. Kael was already gathering supplies, his movements quick and practiced. If they're deploying servitors in the lower hive, they're not trying to capture you anymore. They're trying to flush you out or kill anything that might be hiding you. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by the whir of servo motors and the clicking of targeting systems running through activation sequences. Through the doorway, Ben caught his first glimpse of them. They had been human once the basic structure was still recognizable, but their flesh had been augmented with machinery. Their skulls opened to install control units, their limbs replaced with weapons platforms. They moved in perfect unison, a dozen pairs of dead eyes, scanning the abandoned control room with the dispassionate efficiency of hunting dogs following a scent. Ben's hand went to the Omnitrix. The device had recharged enough for one transformation, maybe two, if he was lucky. But transforming would give away his position immediately, and there was no guarantee he could take down a dozen servitors before they killed Kael and Mara. There's a maintenance shaft behind the cogitator bank, Kael whispered. It connects to the vertical transit system. If we can reach it. The lead servitor's head snapped toward them, targeting laser painting a red dot on Kael's chest. Its arm-mounted weapon began to spin up, barrels rotating with a sound like a mechanical wasp preparing to strike. Ben moved without thinking, slamming his hand down on the Omnitrix. The transformation took him as the servitor opened fire, and suddenly he was much, much smaller. Grey Matter's tiny form darted forward, his enhanced brain already calculating angles and trajectories. The servitor's shots tore through the space where he'd been standing, chewing through corroded metal and ancient machinery. But Ben was already gone, scurrying across the floor with a speed that belied his diminutive size. His Galvan intellect processed the servitor's programming in seconds. Identify their weaknesses, their blind spots, the parameters of their search protocols. They were sophisticated, but they were still machines. And machines could be outsmarted. Grey Matter leaped onto the nearest servitor's leg and began climbing tiny hands, finding purchase in the gaps between flesh and machinery. The servitor registered the presence, but couldn't target something so small on its own body. Ben reached the control unit implanted in its skull and began manipulating the exposed circuitry, his enhanced intelligence allowing him to understand the Imperial technology despite its crude brutality. The servitor stopped moving. Its targeting systems locked onto its companions instead of the empty air. Ben jumped clear as it opened fire, its weapons tearing into the servitors flanking it. The others responded with mechanical efficiency, cutting down their corrupted brother with concentrated fire. In the confusion, Kael grabbed Mara and ran for the maintenance shaft. Ben followed in a series of bounds that carried his tiny form across meters of space, his Galvan agility making up for his lack of size. They plunged into the shaft just as the remaining servitors regained their targeting locks, last fire scorching the air where they'd been. The shaft was vertical, a nightmare drop into darkness, lit only by the occasional failing lumen. Kael had some kind of grappling device, a crude contraption of cable and magnetized hooks that caught on the shaft's walls and arrested their fall. Ben clung to Mara's shoulder, his tiny claws finding purchase in the fabric of her ragged shirt. Above them, the servitors' footsteps echoed, but they didn't follow into the shaft. Apparently, their programming didn't include vertical pursuit in unstable structures. Small mercies. They descended for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, dropping deeper into the lower hive's bowels than Ben had thought possible. The temperature rose, the air grew thick with industrial heat, and through the shaft's corroded walls, he could hear the thunder of ancient machinery, still laboring after millennia of service. Finally, Kael's grapple caught on something solid, and they swung into a side passage. Ben dropped from Mara's shoulder and felt the transformation begin to fade. The Omnitrix had nothing left to give. The device's power reserves were completely depleted. He'd be stuck in human form for at least an hour, maybe more. They collapsed in a heap, gasping for breath, in air that tasted of sulfur and machine oil. Somewhere far above, alarms were wailing. Somewhere even farther above, in his command throne aboard the orbital station, Inquisitor Malreth was reviewing the servitor data and making new calculations. The prey had proven more resourceful than anticipated. The artifact's capabilities exceeded initial projections. Standard containment protocols had failed. It was time to deploy something that standard protocols couldn't handle. Something that didn't rely on servitors or sweep patterns or careful calculation. It was time to unleash a weapon that existed for one purpose: to kill things that couldn't be killed by normal means. Inquisitor Malreth opened a secured Vox channel to the depths of his sanctum, where things were kept that even the Inquisition preferred to forget about. "Wake the Eversor," he commanded. "Target parameters are in your mission briefing. Rules of engagement: total extermination, collateral damage acceptable. Civilian casualties irrelevant. Kill the anomaly. Recover the device. Purge anything that aided it." Deep in the containment cells, where madness and murder had been distilled into human form and bound by chemical restraint, something began to scream. Not in pain or fear, but in joy. The Eversor assassin was finally being unleashed. In the darkness of the lower hive, Ben Tennyson sat with his back against a wall, watching a little girl sleep despite the horrors surrounding her. He didn't know that death itself was coming for him. He didn't know that the Imperium had decided he was worth the cost of deploying its most terrifying weapon. All he knew was that people were suffering, and he couldn't look away. The hunt was about to enter its final, bloodiest phase. The Eversor assassin, designated Theta 7 Secundus, had not experienced anything resembling human emotion in 17 years. The neural surgery and chemical conditioning had stripped away everything except the capacity for violence and the hunger to inflict it. But as the restraint clamps released and combat stimulants flooded its system, something that might have been joy, or the mechanical echo of joy, surged through what remained of its consciousness. It screamed as it ran, the sound torn from a throat that had been modified to project terror as effectively as its limbs had been modified to deliver death. The scream carried through the voxahorns implanted in its skull, amplified to frequencies that bypassed rational thought and struck directly at the primitive hindbrain. Where fear lived, the lower hive's inhabitants heard it and fled without knowing why, their bodies responding to a predator call older than civilization. The Eversor's targeting cogitators painted the world in thermal signatures and electromagnetic spectra. It saw through walls, tracked heat signatures, through meters of rockcrete, followed the distinctive energy pattern of the Xenos artifact, with the single-minded focus of a missile seeking its target. The mission parameters were simple, beautiful in their clarity. Locate the anomaly, terminate the anomaly, recover the device, eliminate all witnesses, acceptable losses total, expected survival rate of nearby civilians 0. It loved its work. Ben woke to the sound of screaming, and for a moment in the disorientation of exhausted sleep, he thought he was back home dealing with another alien invasion. Then the smell hit him, rust and chemicals and human misery concentrated over millennia, and he remembered where he was. The screaming wasn't the panicked cry of civilians fleeing danger. It was something else, something that made his skin crawl with primal dread. Kael was already moving, gathering supplies with the frantic efficiency of someone who had learned to recognize different kinds of danger by their approach sounds. Mara clutched her ragged blanket eyes, wide but dry. She'd probably learned years ago that tears accomplished nothing. "What is that?" Ben asked, checking the Omnitrix. The device showed partial charge enough for maybe 3 transformations, if he was lucky and didn't push them too long. Eversor. Kael's voice was flat empty of hope. They're assassins. Temple-trained killers loaded with combat drugs and neural modifications. One of them can depopulate an entire hab block in hours. He looked at Ben, and for the first time since they'd met, fear showed clearly on his face. They don't stop. They don't negotiate. They don't feel pain or fear or mercy. And if one's been sent after you... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The screaming was getting closer, accompanied now by the sounds of structural collapse and weapons fire that cut off with terminal abruptness. Whatever was coming, it was coming fast, and it was killing everything in its path. "We need to split up," Ben said. "If it's tracking the Omnitrix, it's after me. You two can run where?" Kael's laugh was bitter. "This is the lower hive. There's nowhere to go that it can't follow. And if it's under extremist protocols, it won't stop with you. It'll kill everyone in this sector just to ensure no witnesses survive." He grabbed Mara, pulling her close. "Our only chance is if you can kill it first." "I don't kill people," Ben said automatically. "It's not people anymore. It's a weapon with a human frame. And if you don't stop it, everyone down here dies. Not just us, everyone." Kael's grip on Mara tightened. "I've seen what happens when the Imperium decides a sector is contaminated. They burn it, collapse the hab blocks, and pump in toxins until nothing lives, not even the rats. That's what extremist means. You've become important enough to justify genocide." The screaming was close now, maybe 1 level above them. Ben heard the distinctive sound of loss fire followed by something wet and final. The weapons fire stopped. The screaming continued now, joined by a sound like meat being processed through industrial machinery. Ben's hand moved to the Omnitrix. 3 charges. 3 chances to stop something that the Imperium considered the ultimate solution to unkillable threats. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent years being the thing that stopped unstoppable monsters. Now, he was the monster being hunted. "Hide," he told Kael. "Take Mara and hide as deep as you can. I'll draw it away. It'll track you by the device. You can't hide while wearing that thing." "I'm not planning to hide." Ben walked toward the corridor entrance, each step feeling like crossing an enormous distance. Behind him, Kael herded Mara into the deepest shadows of the abandoned control room. The Omnitrix glowed softly on his wrist, its light seeming obscenely cheerful in the industrial gloom. He could feel it charging, drawing power from ambient energy sources he couldn't identify. In another hour, maybe 2, he'd have full access to his transformations again. But he didn't have another hour. He had minutes at best. The wall exploded inward. Not breached, exploded as if something had hit it with the force of a small bomb. Through the dust and debris came a shape that made Ben's combat instincts scream warnings in a language older than words. It had been human once. The basic structure was still recognizable. But everything soft had been stripped away, replaced with angular armor plating and weapon systems that covered every surface. Its face was a skull wrapped in synthetic muscle, its eyes burning with the manic intensity of someone running on combat drugs potent enough to kill a normal human through sheer chemical overload. It saw Ben. Its head cocked to the side with a motion too fast, too mechanical to be natural. Then it screamed again, and this time Ben understood that the scream wasn't random noise. It was psychological warfare, a weapon designed to break the will of anyone who heard it. The Eversor charged. Ben slapped the Omnitrix. The transformation took him as the assassin covered half the distance between them in a single bound. XLR8's streamlined form emerged from the green flash, and suddenly the world slowed to a crawl. The Eversor was faster than anything human had a right to be. But a kind of Solarian biology operated on a different temporal scale. Ben dodged the first strike easily, the assassin's power fist passing through the space where he'd been standing with enough force to pulverize rockcrete. He ran not away but around, testing the Eversor's capabilities. It tracked him with its head, but couldn't quite rotate fast enough to maintain targeting lock. Its weapons were built for overwhelming force, not precision against high-speed targets. Ben could work with that. XLR8 struck a hit-and-run attack that targeted the assassin's exposed joints. His tail whipped across the back of its knee joint with enough force to buckle metal. The Eversor stumbled, caught itself spun with impossible speed. Its fist caught XLR8 in the ribs, not a clean hit, just a glancing blow. But it still sent Ben crashing through a cogitator bank with enough force to shatter the ancient machinery. Pain exploded through his alien form. At least 2 ribs cracked, maybe more. The Eversor didn't give him time to recover, launching itself at him with single-minded purpose. Ben rolled aside the assassin's power fist, cratering the floor where his head had been. He kicked off its back, using the momentum to build distance, but the Eversor was already turning, already tracking, already moving with the relentless efficiency of a machine that had been built for exactly this purpose. This wasn't working. XLR8 was fast, but the Eversor was fast enough to be dangerous, and every hit it landed did damage that accumulated. Ben needed something with more durability, more raw power to match the assassin's augmented strength. The Omnitrix timer chimed a warning. Ben hit the symbol on his chest as he ran, trusting the device to give him something useful. The transformation rippled through him, mass and muscle piling onto his frame. Wrath emerged from the green flash, orange fur bristling and claws extending. "Let me tell you something, creepy robot assassin." Wrath bellowed, his apoplexian aggression overriding Ben's normal restraint. "Wrath doesn't run from fights. Wrath runs to fights, and you just picked a fight with the wrong alien." The Eversor's response was to draw a blade from its forearm sheath, not a normal blade, but something that crackled with disruption fields and moved through the air, leaving trails of distorted space. It lunged the blade, tracking toward Wrath's throat with surgical precision. Wrath caught the blade between his claws, his enhanced strength and durability allowing him to stop the strike through sheer force. The disruption field screamed against his alien biology, trying to unmake him at the molecular level. But apoplexian physiology was notoriously resistant to exotic damage. He twisted, trying to wrench the blade from the assassin's grip. The Eversor responded by activating its backup weapons. Needle launchers in its shoulders spat toxin-coated projectiles. Melta charges in its chest cavity, armed and prepared to fire at point-blank range. It was willing to damage itself if that damage would eliminate the target. Self-preservation wasn't part of its programming. Wrath released the blade and threw himself backward as the Melta charges detonated. Superheated air washed over him, singing fur and flash-burning exposed skin. The assassin came through the flames, its armor scorched, but its function unimpaired. It was laughing now, a sound rendered even more horrifying by the synthetic quality of its voice. Target demonstrates enhanced durability, escalating countermeasures, acceptable loss of surrounding structure total. The Eversor reached for something on its belt, and Ben's danger sense screamed a warning louder than any before. Whatever weapon the assassin was reaching for, it was something that made Melta charges look subtle. Something designed to level entire hab blocks. Ben hit the Omnitrix again, abandoning Wrath, for something that didn't rely on brute force. Ghost Freak materialized from the transformation, his ectoplasmic form immediately phasing out of sync with normal matter. The Eversoar's targeting sensors flickered in confusion, unable to lock onto something that existed partially outside conventional space. But the assassin adapted with terrifying speed. Its cogitators switched to psionic detection arrays, tracking the electromagnetic disturbance that Ghost Freak's presence created. Before Ben could press his advantage, the Eversoar activated a device on its wrist that filled the air with a high-frequency pulse. Not sound psychic noise, a scream in the Imperium that bypassed physical defenses and struck directly at consciousness. Ghost Freak recoiled, his ectoplasmic form destabilizing under the assault. Ben forced the transformation to shift again, the Omnitrix cycling through options with increasing desperation. Wildvine emerged plant-based biology, offering different vulnerabilities than Enka said than ectoplasm or flesh. His tendrils lashed out, trying to entangle the assassin, trying to immobilize it long enough to end this without killing. The Eversoar drew a second blade, this one superheated to temperatures that made the air shimmer. It carved through Wildvine's tendrils like a farmer harvesting wheat, each cut precise and economical. Ben felt each severed tendril as a stab of pain, his plant biology transmitting damage signals in ways his human nervous system couldn't process. He tried to regenerate to outgrow the damage, but the Eversoar was cutting faster than he could heal. The timer chimed again. The Omnitrix was running dangerously low on power, and Ben had burned through 4 transformations in as many minutes. 1 charge left, maybe 2 if he was lucky. And nothing he'd tried had even slowed the assassin down. Behind the Eversoar, Ben caught movement. Mara had emerged from hiding, her small face set in determination. She held something a length of pipe, crude and improvised, but held with the intention of someone about to do something desperately brave and terminally stupid. No. Ben tried to shout, but Wildvine's vocal structure couldn't form human words. The sound that emerged was more plant-like rustling than speech. Mara swung the pipe at the Eversoar's back. It connected with a clang that echoed through the abandoned control room. The assassin didn't even stagger. It simply turned its movements flowing with mechanical precision and backhanded the child across the room. Mara hit the wall with a sound that made Ben's heart stop. She slumped to the floor and didn't move. Something broke in Ben's chest. Not the careful control he'd built over years of being a hero. Something deeper, more fundamental. The part of him that could look at monsters and still see the people they'd been. The part that insisted on mercy, even for enemies who showed none. The Omnitrix flashed red warning of critical power levels. Ben ignored it, hitting the transformation one more time with fingers that trembled with rage. The device cycled, searching its database for something that matched the user's emotional state. Something that reflected the cold fury of someone who had watched one innocent too many get hurt by this nightmare world's machinery. Goop emerged from the final transformation, but different this time. His amorphous body flowed across the floor with predatory purpose, his anti-gravity projector pulsing with unstable energy. The Eversoar lunged its weapons, tracking this new form, but Goop simply flowed around the attacks. He wasn't trying to dodge. He was positioning. The assassin realized its mistake half a second too late. Goop's body wrapped around it, not attacking, but engulfing his amorphous mass, forcing its way into every joint and gap in the Eversoar's armor. The assassin thrashed its enhanced strength, allowing it to tear free portions of Goop's body. But Ben simply flowed back together, pressing inward with inexorable force. He found the Eversoar's air intakes, the mechanisms that fed oxygen to what remained of its biological systems. He covered them, blocked them, squeezed with pressure that cracked armor plating and bent metal that should have been unbreakable. The assassin's movements became frantic, no longer calculated, but desperate. Its weapons fired wildly, burning through portions of Goop's body that reformed as fast as they were destroyed. Ben felt the moment when the Eversoar's oxygen reserves ran out, felt its enhanced metabolism begin to fail as chemical reactions starved for air, felt its servo motors seize as biological components shut down. The assassin collapsed, its body spasming as it fought to draw breath that wouldn't come. It would have taken minutes for a normal human to suffocate. The Eversoar's modifications stretched that to nearly 10 minutes of thrashing fighting, desperately trying to break free. Ben held on through all of it, his Goop form absorbing damage and reforming, tightening his grip with every second that passed. Finally, the Eversoar stopped moving. Its systems shut down one by one, biological failure, cascading through augmetic components until the whole horrifying machine simply ceased to function. Ben held the pressure for another full minute, making absolutely certain. Then he released his body, flowing back into a roughly humanoid shape a few meters away. The transformation timer chimed its last warning. The Omnitrix was dead empty now, its power reserves completely depleted. It would be hours before he could transform again. Ben shifted back to human form and immediately stumbled, exhaustion and pain from multiple injuries catching up with him all at once. He forced himself to move, crossing to where Mara lay, crumpled against the wall. She was breathing shallow and pained, but breathing. Blood trickled from her nose, and when Ben carefully checked her pupils, they were responsive. Concussed, definitely. Possibly internal injuries, but alive. Kyle emerged from the shadows, his face gray with shock. "You killed it. I didn't think." "No one kills Eversoars. They're supposed to be. It's not dead." Ben's voice was hoarse, his throat raw from Wrath's bellowing. "Just unconscious. It'll wake up eventually. Then we need to move. Now, before what?" The voice came from the corridor entrance, cold and precise. Inquisitor Malreth stepped through the hole the Eversoar had made, flanked by a squad of stormtroopers whose weapons tracked Ben with unwavering focus. The Inquisitor's augmetic eye whirred as it focused on the fallen assassin. Remarkable. Theta 7 Secundus survived 6 campaigns against Tyrannid invasion forces. It personally eliminated a Genestealer's patriarch in single combat, and you defeated it without killing. Malreth's gaze shifted to Ben, and there was something in that look that was worse than hatred or fear. It was scientific curiosity, the cold interest of someone who had found a fascinating specimen to dissect. "The Omnitrix is depleted," the Inquisitor observed. "You cannot transform. You cannot flee. And I have 5 stormtroopers with orders to fire on my command." He took a step forward. "Last chance anomaly. Surrender the device. Submit to Imperial authority. I can make the process relatively painless." Ben looked at Mara, still unconscious, in his arms. At Kyle, standing protectively despite having no weapons and no chance against armed soldiers. At the Inquisitor, who saw people as nothing more than resources to be cataloged and consumed. "You know what the worst part about this place is?" Ben said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "It's not the pollution or the poverty or even the casual cruelty. It's that you've all given up. You've decided that this is just how things are, and anyone who suggests it could be different is either insane or dangerous." "Philosophical discourse is irrelevant," Malreth replied. "Surrender now, or I will have my stormtroopers execute the child and the resistance member. You will watch them die before I allow my tech priests to begin your vivisection." Ben stood carefully, setting Mara down and stepping between her and the stormtroopers. His hand moved to the Omnitrix, knowing it was empty, but unable to stop the gesture. "You can't transform," Malreth said. "I can see the device's power level from here. You have no options remaining." "Maybe," Ben said. "Or maybe you've never met anyone stubborn enough to find a third option." He touched the Omnitrix's faceplate, not trying to activate a transformation, but accessing a different function. The Universal Translator. He'd used it before to broadcast messages to communicate across species barriers. Now he used it to amplify his voice through every voxcaster in the sector. Every communication device still functional in the lower hive's depths. "My name is Ben Tennyson." His voice echoed through kilometers of hab blocks and transit corridors. "I'm not from your world. I don't know your emperor, and I don't follow your laws. But I know right from wrong, and I know that threatening to kill children to get what you want is wrong. The Inquisition has declared me Xenos. They've deployed assassins to kill me and anyone who helps me. They're willing to burn this entire sector to ensure I don't escape." Malreth's augmetic eye flared with fury. "Silence him." But Ben kept talking, his voice carrying to thousands of desperate souls living in the lower hive's darkness. "I'm not asking you to fight for me. I'm just asking you to remember that you deserve better than this. That your children deserve better. That maybe, just maybe, the people who tell you to accept suffering as the Emperor's will are the same people who benefit from your suffering." The stormtroopers opened fire. Ben dove for cover, dragging Mara with him. Blast beams scorched the air where he'd been standing, carving through ancient machinery and setting fires that would burn for days. Kyle grabbed a fallen piece of debris and threw it not at the soldiers, but at the control room's support columns, destabilizing the structure. The ceiling groaned. Malreth shouted orders, pulling his stormtroopers back. And in that moment of confusion, Kyle grabbed Ben's arm and pulled him toward a gap in the wall. Not the corridor, but a crack in the structure itself that led to the spaces between hab blocks where even the Imperium's authority couldn't easily reach. They ran through darkness, Kale carrying Mara, while Ben stumbled along on legs that barely supported his weight. Behind them, Malreth's voice crackled through voxcasters, calm and implacable. "Seal all transit routes in the sector. Deploy additional assassins. Implement Protocol Ultima. If the anomaly will not surrender, then we will remove the environment that sustains it." Protocol Ultima. Ben didn't know what that meant, but from the fear in Kyle's eyes, it was nothing good. They descended deeper into Helios 9's bowels, fleeing toward a safety that didn't exist, seeking refuge in a world that had no mercy to give. And far above in the command centers that coordinated Imperial authority, someone was making calculations about acceptable losses. The hunt continued. But the prey had become dangerous, and the hunters were beginning to realize that some things once pushed too far, pushed back with a force that could shake the foundations of the Imperium itself. Protocol Ultima was not a contingency plan designed with mercy in mind. It was the Imperium's answer to contamination that had spread beyond conventional containment, a cleansing fire that made no distinction between guilty and innocent, because in the calculus of Imperial authority, anything touched by corruption was already lost. Inquisitor Malreth had invoked it 3 times in his 300-year career, and each time the results had been the same absolute eradication, followed by centuries of silence where life had once thrived. He stood now in the command sanctum of his orbital station, watching the tactical displays paint Helios 9's lower hive in shades of red that marked population density. Billions of souls stacked in hab blocks that descended kilometers into the planet's crust. Most had never seen sunlight. Most would die without knowing why. But that was acceptable. The anomaly had to be contained, and if the price of containment was measured in millions of innocent lives, Then the Imperium had paid steeper prices before. Status of cyclonic generators. Malreth's voice carried no emotion, only the flat efficiency of someone executing a necessary protocol. The tech priest managing the weapons array bowed his augmented head, mechadendrites writhing with agitated energy. All 17 generators charging Lord Inquisitor. Estimated time to full capacity 4 hours 17 minutes. Target coordinates have been locked to sectors 7 Gamma and surrounding regions. Blast radius will encompass approximately 40% of the lower hive's inhabited zones. 40%. Malreth processed the number with the same clinical detachment he would apply to any logistical calculation. Estimated casualties 3 billion, give or take a few hundred million, depending on evacuation rates and structural integrity during the initial blast wave. The upper hive would survive its void shields, and reinforced architecture would contain the worst of the damage. The middle hive would suffer catastrophic but recoverable losses. The lower hive would simply cease to exist. And the anomaly's last known position. Tracking signals remain inconsistent, my lord. The device it carries appears to be in a low-power state, making precise triangulation difficult. However, probability matrices suggest it remains within the target zone. The tech priest's vocalizer crackled with static. There is a 17.3% chance it may escape the blast radius, if given sufficient warning. Then ensure it receives no warning. Malreth turned from the displays, his augmetic eye whirring as it adjusted focus. Deploy aerial servitors across all transit routes. Any movement toward the upper hive is to be intercepted with lethal force. I want that entire sector sealed. Nothing enters, nothing leaves. By your will, Lord Inquisitor. Malreth allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The anomaly had proven resourceful more so than anticipated. But resourcefulness meant nothing against overwhelming force. In 4 hours, the problem would be solved permanently, and the Omnitrix would be recovered from the ashes. If the device itself couldn't survive cyclonic fire, then its secrets would die with its bearer. Either outcome was acceptable. Deep in the lower hive's darkest reaches, Ben had no concept of the death sentence that had just been pronounced. He was focused on more immediate concerns, specifically keeping Mara alive long enough to find medical help. She had regained consciousness about an hour into their flight, but her pupils were still uneven, and she complained of double vision. Concussion, definitely, possibly worse. Kael led them through passages that seemed to exist more as geological accident than intentional architecture spaces, where hab blocks had settled unevenly over millennia and created gaps that the lower hive's desperate inhabitants had repurposed into smuggling routes and hiding places. The air was thick enough to chew heavy, with the accumulated breath of billions and the chemical exhaust of ancient machinery that should have been decommissioned centuries ago. They finally stopped in what Kael called a safe house, though the term was generous. It was a junction where 3 hab blocks met imperfectly, creating a triangular space barely large enough for the 3 of them to sit. A single lumen flickered overhead, its light filtering through layers of grime to create more shadow than illumination. But it was hidden, and in the lower hive, hidden meant alive. Ben checked the Omnitrix for the 100th time. The device was charging, but slowly, painfully slowly. Maybe another hour before he'd have enough power for a transformation. Maybe 2. The precision of Asmuth's engineering was impressive, but it hadn't been designed for the kind of sustained combat he'd just endured. Tell me about Protocol Ultima, Ben said, breaking the silence that had settled over them like dust. Kael was quiet for a long moment, his hands mechanically checking Mara's pulse and breathing with the practiced efficiency of someone who had seen too many injuries. When he spoke, his voice was hollow. It's what they do when they decide a sector is too corrupted to save. They don't send in troops or try to purge selectively. They just... He made a gesture toward the ceiling, toward the sky none of them could see. They burn it. All of it. There are weapons on the orbital stations, cyclonic generators that can crack continents. They don't use them often, but when they do, nothing survives. Ben felt his stomach drop. How long? I don't know. Hours, days. The Inquisition doesn't exactly announce their extermination schedules. Kael's laugh was brittle. But if Malrith declared Ultima, he's already started the process. We're dead, Ben. Everyone in the lower hive is dead. They just haven't told us yet. No. Ben stood or tried to the cramped space barely allowed him to straighten. No, that's not happening. We get everyone out. Sound the evacuation alarms, tell people to head for the upper hive. And go where? Kael's voice cracked. The transit routes will be sealed. The lifts will be locked down. The Arbites will shoot anyone trying to leave the quarantine zone. That's how Ultima works. They seal the sector and then burn it, ensuring the contamination doesn't spread. He looked at Ben with eyes that had seen hope die too many times to muster it again. You wanted to help people. You tried. But this is the Imperium. This is what they do to anything they can't control. Mara stirred her small voice, cutting through the despair. The green light doesn't give up. Hannah said so. She said the green light was the Emperor's answer to the darkness. Ben looked at the child, at her unwavering faith, despite the concussion and the fear and the knowledge that death was coming. Something hardened in his chest, not the cold rage from the ever-sore fight, but something warmer and more dangerous. Determination. Kael, you said there are billions of people in the lower hive. How many in this sector alone? 3 billion, maybe more. The census hasn't been accurate in decades. Kael's expression shifted as he realized where Ben was going. You can't save 3 billion people. You can barely save yourself right now. I don't need to save all of them. I just need to stop the weapon from firing. Ben checked the Omnitrix again. Still charging, still not enough. Where would these cyclonic generators be? The orbital stations, yes, but then I go there. I stop the generators, or I redirect them, or I buy enough time for people to evacuate. Something, anything. Ben met Kael's gaze. I'm not going to sit in a hole and wait to die. That's not who I am. It's not who we are either. The voice came from the passage entrance, and Ben turned to see Henna emerging from the shadows, followed by 24 lower hive residents. They carried improvised weapons, industrial tools repurposed for violence, a few actual firearms that looked like they'd been assembled from spare parts. But more importantly, they carried determination in their eyes, the same desperate courage that came from having nothing left to lose. Word spread about your message? Henna said, her weathered face set in grim lines. About the Inquisition threatening to burn the sector. About you refusing to surrender, even when they threatened the children. She gestured to the people behind her. We've spent our lives accepting that this is just how things are, that the Imperium demands suffering, and our only choice is to suffer quietly or suffer loudly before we die. But you're right. We deserve better. Our children deserve better. Even if that means fighting the Imperium itself, Ben asked. Especially then. Hannah's smile was fierce and entirely without humor. We're dead anyway if you fail. Might as well die doing something that matters. The Omnitrix chimed. Not a full charge, but enough for maybe 3 transformations, if he was careful. Ben looked at the assembled lower hive residents, at their improvised weapons and desperate courage, and made a decision that would either save billions or doom them all. All right, here's what we're going to do. The first indication that something had changed came when the emergency sirens began to wail. Not the standard alerts that announced shift changes or productivity quotas, but the deep bone-shaking tones that Helios 9's inhabitants had been trained to recognize as existential threats. Throughout the lower hive, billions of people stopped what they were doing and looked up towards speakers that crackled with a message that shouldn't have been possible. This is Ben Tennyson. The Imperium has activated Protocol Ultima. In approximately 3 hours, cyclonic generators will fire on the lower hive. You are all being executed for the crime of existing in the same sector as me. I'm trying to stop it, but if I fail, you need to evacuate. Break through the transit barriers if you have to. Flood the upper hive. Make them see you. Make them acknowledge that your people not acceptable casualties. Malrith heard the message in his command sanctum and felt something he hadn't experienced in decades, genuine surprise. The anomaly had accessed the sector's emergency broadcast system, had somehow bypassed encryptions and authentication protocols that should have been unbreakable. Worse, it had told the condemned exactly what was coming. The careful order of Ultima's Seal Contain Eliminate had been disrupted. Lock down all transit routes, Malrith commanded. Deploy riot control servitors at every checkpoint. Anyone attempting to leave the quarantine zone is to be... His words were cut off by a new alert. Energy signatures, dozens of them, all across the lower hive. Not weapons fire or industrial accidents, but coordinated detonations targeting specific infrastructure points. The lower hive's inhabitants were destroying the very transit barriers that confined them, using improvised explosives to blow gaps in bulkheads that had stood for millennia. And through those gaps, they began to move. Not fleeing in blind panic, but advancing with terrible purpose toward the upper hive. Billions of people who had been taught to accept their suffering, suddenly deciding that if they were going to die anyway, they would die making the Imperium acknowledge their existence. Deploy stormtroopers to all breach points, Malrith ordered, his voice sharp with fury. Lethal force authorized. If they cannot be contained, begin cyclonic charge sequence immediately. Lord Inquisitor, the generators require another 2 hours to reach full capacity. Early firing will significantly reduce blast radius and... I am aware of the limitations. Begin charge sequence. We fire in 90 minutes. Ben felt the shift in energy through the Omnitrix, the orbital generators ramping up ahead of schedule. 90 minutes, if his calculations were right. 90 minutes to reach the orbital station, bypass whatever security existed, and disable 17 cyclonic generators before they turned 3 billion people into ash. He touched the Omnitrix, feeling it pulse with available power. 3 charges, maybe 4. He'd need to make each one count. Kyle, get Mara somewhere safe. Get yourself safe. This is going to get bad before it gets better. Where are you going? Ben looked up through the layers of rockcrete and metal and human misery toward the sky he couldn't see, but knew was there. To stop them from killing you. He slammed his hand down on the Omnitrix. The transformation took him in a burst of light that seemed impossibly bright in the lower hive's perpetual gloom. Chromastone emerged his crystalline body, already refracting the ambient light into rainbow patterns that danced across the walls. The journey up was unlike anything Ben had attempted before. He couldn't fly, couldn't teleport, couldn't simply wish himself into orbit. But Chromastone's body was nearly indestructible, and the lower hive's infrastructure was ancient and poorly maintained. He began to climb, using his strength to tear through floors and ceilings, creating a vertical shaft through centuries of accumulated architecture. Stormtroopers tried to stop him at the first checkpoint. Their last fire washed over his crystalline hide and was absorbed, converted into energy that Chromastone stored for later use. He didn't fight back, didn't have time to fight back. He just kept climbing, kept ascending, kept driving toward the surface with single-minded purpose. The middle hive tried to slow him with heavier weapons. Autocannons that would have shredded normal matter sparked harmlessly off Chromastone's body. Servitors with cutting tools managed to score his surface, but couldn't penetrate deep enough to matter. And all the while, the Omnitrix timer counted down, warning that this transformation wouldn't last forever. Ben broke through to the upper hive just as the timer reached critical. The transformation faded, leaving him standing in what looked like a commercial plaza, surrounded by citizens whose clothing and bearing marked them as people who had never known hunger or fear of the dark. They stared at him, this dirt-covered intruder, from the depths with expressions ranging from confusion to disgust. "Move!" Ben gasped, his lungs burning from the exertion. "All of you need to move. They're going to fire on the lower hive, and the blast will..." Silence. The word carried absolute authority, and Ben turned to see Malreth himself standing at the plaza's edge, flanked by a full company of stormtroopers. The Inquisitor's augmetic eye locked onto Ben with targeting precision. "You have disrupted Imperial protocol. You have incited rebellion among the lower classes. You have forced me to accelerate Ultima ahead of schedule. And now you have delivered yourself directly into custody." Ben checked the Omnitrix. One charge left, and the device was already warning that its power reserves were nearly exhausted. One transformation, maybe 5 minutes of uptime if he was lucky. After that, he'd be just a kid in a jacket facing down the full might of the Imperium. The odds were impossible. The situation was hopeless. Ben smiled anyway. "You know what I've learned about impossible odds? They're really just inconvenient odds if you're stubborn enough." He hit the Omnitrix one more time. But instead of Chromastone or XLR8 or any of the heavy hitters, the device gave him something different. Feedback materialized, his body covered in circuits that pulsed with hungry anticipation. His antennae extended already, sensing the massive energy buildup in orbit above them. Malreth's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his augmetic eye. "The cyclonic generators are shielded against energy manipulation. Whatever you're planning." "I'm not planning to manipulate them," Ben said, his conductoid voice carrying harmonic overtones that made the stormtroopers shift nervously. "I'm planning to eat them." He extended his awareness up through the atmosphere toward the orbital stations, where 17 generators hummed with accumulating death. His species could absorb energy from almost any source, electrical, thermal, kinetic, even exotic forms that human science had no names for. The question was whether he could absorb fast enough to drain the generators before they fired. Only one way to find out. Feedback reached out with senses that operated beyond normal perception, feeling for the energy signatures of the cyclonic weapons. Found them, locked on, and began to pull. The generator's charge began to drop. Slowly at first, so subtly that the tech priests monitoring them thought it was instrument error. Then faster, the power bleeding away into nowhere, as feedback drew it down through the atmosphere and into his body. It felt like drinking lightning, mixed with poison, wrong and painful but desperately necessary. Malreth's augmetic eye flared as he received reports from orbit. "Impossible. The generators are sealed systems. Nothing should be able to..." He turned to his stormtroopers. "Kill it, now!" The last fire that had been ineffective against chromastone was even less effective against feedback. Every shot just gave Ben more energy to work with, more power to drain from the generators that were supposed to kill billions. He stood in the center of the plaza, absorbing weapons fire and orbital death in equal measure, his body glowing brighter with each passing second. The Omnitrix timer began its final countdown. 60 seconds, 45, 30. The generator's charge hit 0. 17 cyclonic weapons, their deadly purpose thwarted by one stubborn alien, refusing to let innocent people die. Ben released the energy he'd absorbed in a burst of light that lit up the upper hive like a miniature sun, harmless and brilliant and defiant. Then the timer ran out. Feedback faded back to Ben, leaving him standing in his jacket and jeans, the Omnitrix dark and completely drained on his wrist. He swayed exhaustion, threatening to drop him where he stood. Around him, stormtroopers raised their weapons, ready to end this once and for all. "Hold." Malreth's voice cut through the tension. He studied Ben with that cold scientific curiosity that was somehow worse than hatred. "The anomaly has demonstrated capabilities that exceed all projections. Standard containment has failed. Ultima has failed." His augmetic eye whirred. "It is time to escalate to measures that will ensure permanent resolution." "What's worse than cyclonic generators?" Ben asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. Malreth's thin lips compressed into something that might have been a smile. "Orbital lance bombardment. Precision strikes rather than area saturation. Slower, more expensive, but absolutely unstoppable once locked on target." He made a gesture and the stormtroopers began to close in. "You saved the lower hive today, Anomaly. Congratulations. But you are still one creature against an Imperium that spans 1,000,000 worlds. And we have resources you cannot imagine." Ben looked up at the sky, visible now through the upper hive's reinforced viewports. Somewhere up there, lance weapons were reorienting targeting solutions, being calculated by tech priests who saw people as nothing more than data points. He'd stopped one holocaust. But the Imperium was already preparing another. The question was whether he'd have the strength to stop it again. The orbital lance was not a weapon designed with subtlety in mind. It was the Imperium's answer to targets that required absolute certainty of elimination, a spear of coherent light that could punch through Void Shield's adamantium plating and planetary crust with equal efficiency. The tech priests who maintained such weapons spoke of them with reverence, calling them the Emperor's judgment made manifest, his divine wrath condensed into a beam narrow enough to thread through a needle's eye and powerful enough to crack mountains. Inquisitor Malreth watched the targeting solutions resolve on his command sanctum's hololithic display, each calculation refined by cogitators that had been blessed by the Mechanicus and fed with the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years of warfare. The Anomaly stood in Plaza Dominus Section 14 of the upper hive, surrounded by stormtroopers and utterly depleted of the energy that made it dangerous. The orbital stations had clear line of sight. The lance arrays were charging. In approximately 4 minutes, the problem would be solved with finality that even the Anomaly's remarkable resilience couldn't overcome. "Target lock confirmed." The weapons officer intoned his voice, carrying the mechanical cadence of someone who had interfaced directly with the targeting cogitators. "Estimated impact radius 15 meters. Collateral damage to surrounding structures moderate. Civilian casualties within blast radius approximately 47,000. 47,000. The number registered in Malreth's consciousness with the same weight as any other logistical detail. Acceptable. The upper hive's population numbered in the billions, the loss of 47,000 citizens to eliminate a Xenos threat that had already demonstrated the capability to disrupt cyclonic generators was more than acceptable. It was necessary. "Fire when ready," Malrith commanded. In orbit above Helios 9, lance arrays that had been forged in the shipyards of Mars centuries before, the Imperium's current crisis began to glow with accumulating power. Plasma coils heated to temperatures that would have flash vaporized normal matter. Magnetic containment fields strained to hold energies that wanted nothing more than to explode outward in every direction. And at the center of each array, targeting cogitators made their final calculations. Accounting for planetary rotation, atmospheric distortion, and the infinitesimal movements of a target that was trying very hard not to move at all. Ben felt it before he saw it, a sudden pressure change in the air, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with exhaustion and everything to do with his danger sense screaming warnings in frequencies his human nervous system wasn't designed to process. He looked up just as the first lance strike carved through Helios 19's atmosphere. The beam was white-hot coherence, a column of light so intense it left after-images burned into retinas that witnessed its passage. It struck the plaza where Ben had been standing with enough force to vaporize rockcrete and turn the surrounding air into superheated plasma. The shockwave that followed knocked stormtroopers off their feet and shattered viewports in hab blocks 3 levels away. But Ben wasn't there anymore. The moment his danger sense triggered, he'd moved purely on instinct, throwing himself toward the nearest cover with the desperate speed of someone who had survived too many cosmic-level threats to ignore his body's warnings. The lance strike missed him by perhaps 3 meters, close enough that he felt his jacket char from the ambient heat, close enough that the hair on the left side of his head crisped and fell away in ash. He scrambled behind what had been a decorative column before the lance strike had turned half of it into molten slag. The Omnitrix was still dark on his wrist, still depleted from draining the cyclonic generators. No transformations available. No tricks left except his own human reflexes and whatever cover the upper hive could provide. Which, as it turned out, wasn't much. The second lance strike came 12 seconds after the first, targeting Ben's new position with terrifying precision. He ran not toward any specific destination, but simply away, trusting his instincts to keep him ahead of the targeting solutions. The beam carved through the plaza behind him, through the hab blocks beyond, through anything that had the misfortune of being in a straight line between the orbital station and its target. Stormtroopers tried to intercept him, their training and discipline overriding the very reasonable instinct to flee from orbital bombardment. Ben didn't fight them, didn't have time to fight them. He just kept moving, kept dodging, kept praying that whatever cogitators were calculating his trajectory would lag just far enough behind reality to keep him alive for the next few seconds. The third strike obliterated the commercial sector he'd just fled through. The fourth carved a canyon through 3 levels of hab blocks, exposing interior spaces to toxic atmosphere and causing structural failures that would kill thousands in the subsequent collapse. The fifth missed entirely its targeting solution, disrupted by the debris cloud from the previous strikes. Ben's lungs burned. His legs felt like they were made of lead. The Omnitrix remained stubbornly dark, its charging cycle proceeding at a pace that seemed designed specifically to maximize his suffering. He risked a glance at the device's display and felt his heart sink. Still another minute before he'd have enough power for even a single transformation. 60 seconds. That was how long he had to survive against weapons that could kill him 20 times over. 60 seconds had never seemed longer. The sixth lance strike came so close that Ben felt the beam's edge catch his shoulder. Agony exploded through his nervous system as superheated plasma flash-boiled the moisture in his skin. He stumbled, nearly fell, caught himself on a railing that was already melting from proximity to the beam. His vision swam with pain and exhaustion. And for a moment, Just a moment, he considered stopping. Just stopping and letting the next strike end this. Then he heard the screaming. Not the mechanical scream of the lance weapons, but human voices. Thousands of them, maybe tens of thousands, all crying out in terror as their homes collapsed and fires spread, and the structural integrity of hab blocks that had stood for millennia began to fail under the repeated impacts. People were dying because the Imperium would rather murder 47,000 of its own citizens than let one Xenos escape. The thought cut through Ben's exhaustion like a knife. He forced himself to move, to run, to keep dodging, even though every cell in his body was screaming for rest. The Omnitrix pulsed, not charged, not yet, but getting closer. 30 seconds, 20, 15. The seventh lance strike carved through a transit station, severing the maglev rails and sending a passenger car tumbling through empty air. Ben watched in horror as it fell, knowing he couldn't reach it, couldn't save the people inside. The car hit a lower level with an impact that echoed through the hive like thunder. 10 seconds. The eighth strike targeted not Ben, but the ground beneath his feet, trying to eliminate him through structural collapse rather than direct hit. The floor buckled, then gave way entirely. Ben fell through 3 levels of hab blocks in a cascade of debris and screaming metal, his body taking impacts that would have killed a normal human, but merely added to his growing collection of bruises and lacerations. 5 seconds. He hit something soft, a textile factory's storage area, bales of synthetic fabric that had been stacked for processing. The landing knocked the wind from his lungs and sent fresh spikes of agony through his burned shoulder. He rolled to his feet just as another lance strike carved through the space where he'd been missing him by perhaps 2 meters. 3 seconds. Ben's hand closed around the Omnitrix, feeling it pulse with available power. Not much, barely enough for 1 transformation, maybe 2 if he was willing to push the device past its safety limits. But it was something. It was a chance. 2 seconds. The targeting cogitators in orbit refined their solutions, accounting for the debris cloud and structural instability. The lance arrays swiveled with microscopic precision, bringing their terrible focus to bear on a target that had somehow survived 8 consecutive strikes. In the command sanctum, Malreth leaned forward, his augmetic eye tracking the anomaly's desperate flight. 1 second. Die, Malreth whispered, and the 9th lance strike fired. Ben slammed his hand down on the Omnitrix. The transformation took him as the beam carved through the atmosphere, as the air itself ignited from the sheer concentration of energy. Diamond Head materialized from the green flash, his crystalline body already raising a shield of Petrosapian crystal that spread across his arms, shumam in geometric patterns. The lance struck the shield and stopped. Not deflected, stopped the beam's energy absorbed by crystal that existed partially outside normal space-time. Diamond Head felt the impact like a physical blow, the force of it driving him to one knee, as his body struggled to contain energies that could crack planets. His crystal structure began to glow, first red, then white, then beyond visible spectrum, as he approached the limits of what even Petrosapian biology could withstand. But he held. The beam carved around him, redirected by angles that shouldn't exist in 3-dimensional space, dissipating into the toxic atmosphere in bursts of light that painted the hive in colors that hurt to look at. And when the lance finally cut out, its capacitors drained and requiring another charging cycle, Diamond Head remained standing. Impossible, Malreth breathed, watching the sensor data with something approaching disbelief. The anomaly should have been vaporized. Nothing survives direct lance impact. Nothing. The weapons officer turned from his console, his augmented face expressionless, but his Vox synthesizer carrying undertones of concern. Lord Inquisitor, the strike cruiser reports it will arrive in orbit within 20 minutes. They request permission to deploy boarding teams and establish void superiority. Granted. and inform them that the anomaly has demonstrated resistance to lance bombardment. They are to engage with maximum force immediately upon arrival. Malreth's fingers drummed against his command throne's armrest, the gesture betraying rare agitation. How long until lance arrays can fire again? Minimum 4 minutes for primary array, 7 minutes for full battery. 7 minutes. The anomaly had survived this long against weapons that should have killed it a dozen times over. Malreth made a calculation weighing the value of continued bombardment against the collateral damage already sustained. The upper hive was beginning to destabilize. Structural engineers were reporting catastrophic integrity failures across multiple sectors. If he continued the lance strikes, he risked bringing down sections of the hive that housed the planet's industrial nobility and administrative apparatus. Unacceptable losses. "Cease orbital fire," Malreth commanded, the words tasting like acid. "Deploy all available ground forces. Stormtroopers, Arbites, whatever PDF garrison remains functional. Form a containment perimeter and close it systematically. The anomaly cannot escape atmosphere in its current state. We have time to..." The alert runes on his display shifted from amber to crimson. Energy signature detected. Massive transformation underway. The anomaly was changing form again. Diamond Head's timer chimed, warning of imminent reversion. Ben checked the Omnitrix and saw what he'd feared: one charge left, and the device was redlining from the strain of absorbing lance fire. Whatever transformation came next would be his last for hours, maybe longer. He needed something that could get him out of the upper hive, out of the planet's gravity, well, entirely, if possible. Something fast. Something that could fly. He cycled through his available forms, feeling the Omnitrix's bioelectric feedback as it suggested options based on his intent. XLR-8 was too ground-based. Big Chill could fly, but not fast enough to escape orbital targeting. Jet Tray would be perfect, but the device's depleted state meant he couldn't reliably get Jet Tray. The transformation roulette would give him something close to what he needed, but not necessarily exactly what he wanted. The Omnitrix settled on a selection. Not Jet Tray, but close enough. Ben hit the transformation just as Diamond Head's timer ran out. Astrodactyl emerged from the green flash, and immediately the world opened up in ways that ground-based species couldn't fully appreciate. His propulsion system, a jetpack that was as much a part of his biology as his wings roared to life, lifting him from the ruined textile factory in a burst of acceleration that sent debris scattering. He oriented himself upward toward the sky that was barely visible through layers of toxic cloud and pushed his propulsion to maximum. The upper hive fell away beneath him. Stormtroopers fired their last beams, tracking his ascent, but falling short as he climbed beyond effective range. Hab blocks and transit stations and commercial plazas, all the carefully ordered infrastructure of Imperial authority, shrank to toy-like proportions. And still, he climbed, pushing Astrodactyl's biology to its limits as he raced toward the atmospheric boundary and the void beyond. The lance arrays reacquired targeting lock. In his command sanctum, Malreth watched the anomaly's escape attempt with cold fury. "Fire! All arrays. I want that creature dead before it reaches orbital altitude." The lance strikes came in a storm, not the careful measured shots from before, but a barrage of overlapping fire that turned the upper atmosphere into a hell of superheated plasma and coherent destruction. Astrodactyl dodged, weaved, rolled through the bombardment with a combination of alien reflexes and desperate luck. Beams carved through the space where he'd been moments before, creating a maze of death that required split-second timing to navigate. Ben felt the propulsion system strain under the demands he was placing on it. Astrodactyl could fly fast, but sustained high-speed atmospheric flight while performing combat maneuvers, pushed the transformation's biological capabilities to their absolute limits. His lungs burned from breathing superheated air. His wings ached from repeated high G turns. And the Omnitrix timer was counting down with inexorable certainty. 2 minutes of flight time remaining. Maybe less if he kept pushing this hard. He broke through the first cloud layer, the toxic smog that perpetually shrouded Helios 9, giving way to slightly clearer air. The lance strikes followed the targeting cogitators, compensating for decreased atmospheric distortion with increased accuracy. A beam clipped his left wing, and Ben felt the synthetic muscle tear. His flight pattern destabilized, sending him into a spin that took precious seconds to recover from. 1 minute, 30 seconds. The second cloud layer loomed ahead, this one composed of ash and industrial particulate that had been accumulating in the upper atmosphere for millennia. Ben plunged into it, hoping the reduced visibility would throw off the targeting solutions. The lance strikes continued, but their accuracy dropped. The cogitators were extrapolating his position based on trajectory rather than direct observation. 1 minute. He burst through the final cloud layer into atmosphere so thin it could barely be called air. The sky above had shifted from toxic gray to deep purple, the color of a world's edge, where chemistry gave way to vacuum. Stars became visible cold and distant, and entirely uncaring about the desperate flight happening below them. And among those stars, something was moving. Something massive and terrible that Ben's astrodactyl vision resolved into a ship of impossible scale. The strike cruiser was 3 kilometers of gothic architecture and apocalyptic firepower, its hull encrusted with weapons batteries and lance arrays that dwarfed anything the orbital stations mounted. It moved through space with the ponderous grace of something too massive to be graceful, adjusting its trajectory to intercept the atmospheric breach point. Maglocks on its hull began to open, releasing boarding craft and fighter escorts that spread out in formations designed to ensure nothing could slip through their net. 30 seconds. Ben pushed Astrodactyl's propulsion system past redline, feeling biological components begin to fail under the strain. His wing muscles were shredding, his propulsion system was overheating, and the Omnitrix timer was flashing its final warning, indicating that transformation reversion was imminent and unavoidable. 20 seconds. The vacuum transition hit him like a wall. Astrodactyl could survive in space. The species had evolved for exactly that purpose. But the sudden shift from thin atmosphere to hard vacuum required biological adjustments that took time Ben didn't have. His propulsion sputtered. His vision swam with hypoxia. And still he pushed forward, knowing that if he reverted to human form in vacuum, he would die before the strike cruiser's weapons could finish him. 10 seconds. The boarding craft were closing, their pilots displaying skill that spoke of centuries of experience hunting targets in the void. Lance fire from the cruiser carved through space around him. Each beam precisely calculated to herd him toward the boarding craft, rather than destroy him outright. They wanted him alive now, or at least intact enough for the tech priests to salvage the Omnitrix from his corpse. 5 seconds. Ben saw his destination, a debris field left over from some long-ago void, battle chunks of destroyed ships and shattered armor plating that floated in orbital paths. If he could reach it, if he could hide among the debris before the transformation ran out, he might survive long enough for the Omnitrix to recharge. It was a desperate plan. It was probably a futile plan, but it was the only plan he had. 3 seconds. He dove toward the debris field, using the last of his propulsion system's reserves to build velocity that he'd maintain even after reverting to human form. The boarding craft followed their weapons, firing penetrating rounds, designed to disable rather than destroy. One caught his remaining good wing, tearing through muscle and membrane. Another grazed his propulsion system, causing it to sputter and die. 1 second. The Omnitrix timer ran out. Astrodactyl faded, and suddenly Ben was tumbling through vacuum in nothing but his jacket and jeans, his lungs screaming for air that didn't exist, his blood beginning to boil in the zero-pressure environment. He had perhaps 15 seconds of consciousness, remaining the same 15 seconds that a human body could survive unprotected exposure to space before permanent damage set in. He used those seconds to aim himself at the largest piece of debris he could identify, a section of hull plating, maybe 20 meters across, pitted with weapons fire and marked with symbols he didn't recognize. The impact drove what little air remained in his lungs out in a silent explosion. He grabbed for purchase, finding a gap in the plating that he could wedge himself into, pressing his body into the minimal shelter it provided. The boarding craft swept past their sensors, scanning the debris field with methodical precision. Ben held perfectly still, his vision fading to gray as hypoxia claimed his consciousness. The Omnitrix was dark on his wrist, completely drained by the sustained transformations and barely clinging to enough power to maintain its basic functions. Around him, the debris field tumbled through its endless orbital dance, each piece a fragment of some ancient battle that had been forgotten by everyone except the void itself. In his command sanctum, Malreth watched the sensor returns with barely contained fury. The anomaly had escaped, had somehow survived cyclonic generators, lance bombardment, and a strike cruiser's interception to disappear into a debris field that stretched across hundreds of kilometers of orbital space. Searching it would take days. Days during which the creature could potentially repair its device and escape entirely. But the Inquisitor was nothing if not patient. He had hunted Xeno's threats for 3 centuries. He could wait a few days more. "Establish search pattern," Malreth commanded. "Deploy sensor nets across the entire debris field. Nothing enters or leaves without our knowledge. And inform the strike cruiser that the anomaly is to be considered dormant, but not dead. When we find it, and we will find it, I want overwhelming force brought to bear immediately." The orders dispersed through the Imperial command structure with efficient brutality. Above Helios 9, the strike cruiser assumed high orbit, its sensors painting the debris field with active scans that could detect a human heartbeat through meters of armor plating. Boarding craft formed patrol patterns, their pilots alert for any sign of movement. And among the ruins of long-dead ships, a 16-year-old boy drifted in and out of consciousness, clinging to life by the thinnest of margins, while the Omnitrix struggled to accumulate enough power to save him. The hunt had reached stalemate. The Imperium had cornered its prey, but couldn't deliver the killing blow. And the prey had escaped, but couldn't escape entirely. What happened next would depend on which side's resources failed. First, Ben's ability to survive in vacuum, or the Imperium's patience in hunting someone who had already demonstrated an alarming capacity to survive the unsurvivable. In the darkness between worlds, the clock was ticking. Consciousness returned in fragments, each one accompanied by pain that suggested Ben's body was filing formal complaints about recent treatment. His lungs felt like they'd been scoured with sandpaper. His skin tingled with the aftermath of vacuum exposure, capillary damage, and flash freezing that would leave bruises in patterns he didn't want to think about. And his shoulder, where the lance beam had grazed him, throbbed with a steady pulse that matched his heartbeat and promised infection if he didn't get proper medical attention soon. He opened his eyes to darkness, broken only by the Omnitrix's faint glow. The device had somehow maintained enough power to generate a minimal life support field, not enough to be comfortable, but enough to keep him from dying while unconscious. Ben had never been so grateful for Azimuth's paranoid over-engineering. The Galvan had built the Omnitrix to survive things that would kill its user, and that redundancy had just saved Ben's life for probably the 100th time. He was wedged into a gap in what looked like part of a ship's hull, plating the metal pitted with age and weapons fire. Through the gap, He could see the curve of Helios 9 below a world that looked almost beautiful from orbit, its toxic atmosphere creating swirls of color that hid the nightmare of human suffering occurring on its surface. Around him, the debris field stretched away into the darkness, thousands of fragments from battles fought so long ago that no one remembered what the fighting had been about. The Omnitrix pulsed, drawing his attention. Its display showed a charging cycle that was maybe halfway complete enough for one transformation too, if he was willing to push it and risk permanent damage to the device. Not enough to fight his way through a strike cruiser and whatever other Imperial forces were hunting him, but maybe, just maybe enough to escape. Ben pulled up the device's scanning functions, grateful that those at least didn't require full power. The results painted a picture that was both better and worse than he'd feared. The strike cruiser was in high orbit, its position suggesting it was conducting systematic sweeps of the debris field. Boarding craft patrolled established routes, their patterns methodical and thorough. Sensor nets had been deployed not everywhere yet, but spreading outward from Ben's last known position with the inexorable patience of a predator that knew its prey couldn't run forever. But there were gaps. Blind spots where the debris was too dense for effective scanning, where ancient hull plating and radiation from long-dead reactors created interference that even Imperial technology couldn't fully penetrate. And beyond the debris field, at the edge of sensor range, Ben detected something else, gravitational anomalies consistent with a warp translation point. Ships entered and left the system through those coordinates, their passage creating ripples in space-time that the Omnitrix could detect, even if Imperial sensors couldn't. A plan began to form. Not a good plan. Ben was honest enough with himself to recognize that. But a plan. If he could reach one of the blind spots, if he could wait for a ship to begin its warp translation, if he could time a transformation perfectly to ride the gravitational wake out of the system. Too many ifs. But it was better than staying here and waiting for the sensor nets to find him. He checked the Omnitrix one more time. 30 minutes until he'd have enough power for a reliable transformation. 30 minutes to plan to prepare to make peace with the fact that this escape attempt would either work perfectly or kill him spectacularly with no middle ground. Below him, on the surface of Helios 9, the aftermath of his intervention was still unfolding in ways that would reshape the planet's future. In the lower hive, Henna stood among the ruins of what had been Sector 7 Gamma, looking at the destruction the Imperium had been willing to inflict to eliminate one target. Thousands dead from the Lance bombardment. Tens of thousands more injured or displaced. The structural damage alone would take years to repair, and that was assuming the Imperium bothered to repair it, rather than simply sealing off the compromised sectors and forgetting they existed. But they had survived. 3 billion people who had been marked for death by cyclonic fire had lived to see another day, another shift, another grinding moment of existence in the Imperium's vast machinery. And they knew everyone in the lower hive, knew that survival had come, because one stranger with a green light on his wrist had refused to accept that their deaths were inevitable. "The Inquisition is putting out the official story," Kale said, joining Henna at the observation point. Mara slept in his arms, sedated with medicines from the Resistance's meager supplies. Her concussion would heal, but she'd carry the scars from this day for the rest of her life. "They're saying the green light was a Xenos infiltrator, that he used forbidden technology to corrupt the minds of the faithful, that the Lance bombardment was necessary to prevent a demonic incursion." "And what are people saying?" Henna asked. Kale's smile was bitter, but real. "They're saying the Inquisition is full of shit. They're saying a hero came to Helios 9 and the Imperium tried to kill him for saving people. They're saying that maybe just Maybe the Emperor's light doesn't shine quite as brightly from Terra as the priests claim. He looked at the Omnitrix symbol that someone had spray-painted on a nearby wall, the green hourglass rendered in crude but unmistakable detail. You can't put this back in the bottle, Henna. The people saw what happened. Saw the Imperium willing to murder billions of its own citizens rather than admit they couldn't catch one target. The Inquisition will purge anyone who speaks of this openly, Henna said. Let them try. Kael's voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. There are 3 billion witnesses spread across 100 sectors. They can't disappear us all. And every person they do disappear just proves the point that the Imperium fears us more than it fears the Xenos or the demons. Around them, in the darkness of the lower hive, similar conversations were happening in 1,000 places. The green light had become more than a person. He'd become an idea, a symbol of the possibility that things could be different, that authority could be questioned, that suffering wasn't inevitable, that even one person, if stubborn enough, could make the Imperium blink. It was a dangerous idea. The kind of idea that started rebellions and brought down governments. The kind of idea that the Inquisition had spent 10,000 years trying to extinguish wherever it appeared. But ideas were harder to kill than people. Ideas spread like fire, jumping from mind to mind, faster than any orbital bombardment could track. The green light had saved 3 billion lives. But perhaps more importantly, he'd given them something that the Imperium worked very hard to prevent its citizens from possessing hope. In his command sanctum, Inquisitor Malreth reviewed the reports from Helios 9, the surface, with mounting concern. Not fear, he had long ago excised that weakness from his emotional repertoire, but the cold recognition that a situation was developing beyond his capacity to control. The lower hive was in a state that administrative records would classify as restive. Workers were missing shifts. Production quotas were going unfulfilled. And most concerning of all, citizens were openly discussing the events of the last solar day in direct contradiction of the official narrative. Sedition was spreading, and the usual tools for controlling it, summary execution, targeted purges. Demonstration of overwhelming force seemed to be having the opposite effect. Every person the Arbites disappeared became a martyr. Every sector that was sealed became proof of the story people were telling each other. The Imperium's machinery of control, so effective for so long, was showing cracks that Malreth couldn't simply burn away with lance fire. The anomaly has become a symbol, he said, speaking more to himself than to the servo skull that dutifully recorded his words. It is no longer sufficient to simply kill it. We must discredit it, break the narrative that has formed around its actions. But how did one discredit someone who had demonstrably saved 3 billion lives? How did one convince people that their savior had been their enemy when they had watched the Imperium try to murder them all? Malreth had faced Xenos invasions and demonic incursions and heretical uprisings. But this was different. This was an enemy that lived in people's hearts rather than on the battlefield. Continue the search, he finally ordered. Find the anomaly, recover the device, and then, he paused, calculating. Then we make it disappear quietly. No public execution, no spectacle. It simply vanishes, and over time people will forget. The symbol will fade to legend, legend to myth, myth to nothing. It was a long-term strategy, the kind of patient purge that Malreth had executed successfully many times before. All it required was finding the target and eliminating it without creating more martyrs. All it required was capturing someone who had survived everything the Imperium had thrown at him. 30 minutes passed with the slow inevitability of stellar mechanics. Ben spent the time planning triple-checking the Omnitrix's data and trying not to think about how many things could go wrong with his escape attempt. Finally, the device chimed softly, indicating it had accumulated enough power for a transformation. Not a full charge, not nearly enough for extended use, but sufficient for what he needed. In the distance, Ben could see a ship beginning its departure sequence, its engines glowing as they prepared for the gravitational stress of warp translation. It was smaller than the strike cruiser, some kind of transport or supply vessel, but it was moving toward the translation point he'd identified. This was his window. He touched the Omnitrix, selecting his transformation carefully. He needed speed survivability in hard vacuum and enough maneuverability to ride a warp wake without being torn apart by the gravitational shear. The device cycled through options and settled on one that met all those requirements. XLR-8 materialized from the green flash, his streamlined form immediately suited for the vacuum environment. Kinocelerans had evolved on a world with minimal atmosphere. They could function in space for limited periods, using their incredible speed to generate enough momentum to move between orbital bodies. It wasn't true spaceflight, but it was enough. Ben pushed off from his hiding place, building velocity as he maneuvered through the debris field. The boarding craft were distant. Their patrol patterns hadn't yet brought them to this sector. The strike cruiser's sensors were focused elsewhere, sweeping regions of the debris field, where probability suggested the target was more likely to be hiding. For just a few minutes, Ben had a gap in the coverage. He used those minutes to build speed to position himself in the transport ship's wake as it accelerated toward the translation point. The warp engines were charging now, their exotic energies creating distortions that even XLR-8's alien perception found difficult to process. Reality was getting ready to fold, to create a tunnel through the Imperium that would carry the ship light years from Helios 9. And if Ben's timing was right, that tunnel would carry him too. The strike cruiser's sensors finally detected the energy signature, but too late. Alarms blared across Imperial command channels as the anomaly's position was identified, fleeing the debris field at velocities that shouldn't be possible for anything biological. Boarding craft changed course. Lance arrays began targeting solutions, but the transport ship was already entering its translation sequence. Reality folded. The ship disappeared into the warp, carrying with it the gravitational wake that XLR-8 was riding like a surfer catching a wave. Ben felt forces that human physics had no words for, felt the Imperium's touch against his consciousness like oil against his thoughts. The Omnitrix screamed warnings, its systems detecting energies that could corrupt or destroy anything not properly shielded. Then, as quickly as it began, the translation was over. XLR-8 tumbled through normal space again, the transport ship already vanishing into the distance, with no idea it had carried an unintended passenger. Ben was light years from Helios 9, in a region of space his Omnitrix couldn't immediately identify. Lost injured with barely enough power remaining to transform one more time. But alive. Against everything the Imperium had thrown at him, impossibly and stubbornly alive. The transformation timer chimed. XLR-8. It faded back to Ben, leaving him floating in the darkness between stars, with no ship, no supplies, and no clear path home. The Omnitrix was dead on his wrist, its power completely exhausted by the strain of warp translation. It would be days before he could transform again, weeks before he'd have enough power to attempt another dimensional jump. But none of that mattered right now. Right now, Ben was just grateful to be breathing, to be thinking, to be something other than a statistic in the Imperium's endless calculations about acceptable losses. He looked back toward where Helios 9 should be, too far to see with human eyes, too far to reach without a ship. But not too far to remember. The people he'd fought for. The children like Mara, who deserved better than grinding poverty and casual cruelty. The resistance members like Kyle and Henna, who had risked everything to help a stranger. I'll find a way back. Ben promised the darkness. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday, when he was stronger and smarter, and better prepared to face an Imperium that would never stop hunting him. On Helios 99, in the depths of the lower hive, someone added another detail to the growing mural of the green light. This time, the image showed him not fighting or fleeing, but simply standing with his hand raised in farewell. Beneath it, someone had written in careful Gothic script, "He will return." It was probably wishful thinking. Probably just the desperate hope of people who wanted to believe that salvation was possible, that heroes existed, that the universe contained more than endless suffering under an indifferent emperor's gaze. But Inquisitor Malreth, reviewing the reports of sedition and unrest spreading across Helios 9, couldn't shake the concern that maybe, just maybe, the people were right. The anomaly had survived everything, had become something larger than itself, a symbol that refused to die, even when its physical form was light years away. The hunt would continue. The Imperium would never stop searching for the green-lit stranger who had defied its authority. But Malreth was beginning to suspect that even if they found the anomaly and destroyed it, the damage had already been done. Ideas once planted were impossible to fully eradicate. And the idea that 3 billion people had been saved by someone who refused to accept their deaths as inevitable, that was an idea with power beyond anything the Inquisition knew how to fight. In the darkness between stars, Ben Tennyson drifted and dreamed of home. Around him, the universe continued its ancient patterns, uncaring and vast. But somewhere in that vastness, 3 billion people were going about their lives they still had, because one stubborn teenager with an alien device had decided that acceptable losses was never an acceptable answer. The green light had left Helios 9, but the light he'd brought, the hope, the defiance, the stubborn insistence that people mattered, that light would burn in the lower hive's darkness for generations to come. And perhaps in a galaxy drowning in darkness, that was enough.